They came not just with swords, but with sails that carried them farther than anyone thought possible, reshaping worlds from Baghdad to Newfoundland. Behind the terror of their raids lies a deeper story of traders, settlers, and dreamers who carved their legacy into the very fabric of Europe. The first shouts of terror came not from a battlefield, but from a monastery. In 793, the monks of Lindisfarne looked out over the grey swells of the North Sea and saw long, narrow ships knifing towards shore. From their decks leapt men with axes and spears, their shouts carried by the wind. Gold and silver chalices, manuscripts, and relics were torn from the church. Some monks fled, others were slaughtered. To contemporaries, it seemed the end of the world. These men, strange, ruthless, and swift, became branded forever as Vikings. Yet the story of who they were and what they accomplished is far greater than a single raid on a holy island. What unfolded across the next 3 centuries was not simply plunder, but the building of networks, settlements, and kingdoms that stretched from the Atlantic to the edges of Asia. The image of the Viking as a horn-helmeted barbarian is one of history's most enduring myths, yet it obscures a truth more complicated and more astonishing. These people were indeed raiders, but they were also artisans and shipwrights, farmers and traders, mercenaries and explorers. Their world stretched far beyond the fjords of Norway or the forests of Sweden. In fragile-looking wooden vessels, they pushed down rivers into the heart of Russia, opened markets with the Abbasid Caliphate, settled farmland in Ireland, and carved new societies in Iceland and Greenland. Their ships appeared without warning on the coasts of Francia, England, and Spain. Their swords flashed in Sicily and Jerusalem. For generations, their presence was recorded in prayers of fear. From the fury of the Northmen, "O Lord, deliver us." Yet their impact would be written into the DNA, language, and culture of half the world. What made their sudden appearance so shocking was not simply their ferocity, but their mobility. Europe's kingdoms in the late 8th century were used to border skirmishes, invasions by land, and occasional pirate attacks at sea. But the longship changed the rules entirely. With shallow drafts, these ships could sail across open ocean and then pivot into narrow rivers, striking at the very heart of kingdoms that believed themselves safe inland. No village, monastery, or town close to a river mouth was beyond their reach. And because the same vessel could carry warriors, cargo, and livestock, the line between raiding and settlement blurred. A fleet could burn a town one year and return the next to build houses beside its charred ruins. In this way, a reputation for terror cloaked an expansion that was also about permanence. But why did it begin at all? Scandinavia was no wasteland, yet its rocky soil and short growing seasons meant that population growth pressed hard against the limits of farmland. Younger sons, with no inheritance to expect, looked outward. Ambition, the lure of silver, and the promise of land fused with a maritime culture already comfortable with risk. When the first raids succeeded, the rewards encouraged more expeditions. The silver dirhams of the Islamic world began to flow northward, melted down and chopped into hack silver for trade. With wealth came power, and with power came the transformation of Viking leaders into kings, jarls, and founders of dynasties that would shape medieval Europe. The terror they inspired was real. Monks chronicled them as God's punishment on sinful kingdoms. Chroniclers painted them as demons from the sea, whose cruelty defied Christian imagination. Yet, to step back from those accounts is to see a broader canvas. The same men who swung axes at Lindisfarne also brought traders to Dublin's markets, married local women, and raised children who called both Norse and Gaelic gods their own. They minted coins in York, wrote sagas in Iceland, and carried amber and walrus ivory from the frozen north to the bazaars of Baghdad. Their reach was not merely destructive, it was connective, binding together far-flung corners of the world in webs of trade, war, and migration. To say they conquered half the world is less about planting flags and more about creating systems that left marks still visible today. They never built an empire in the Roman sense, but their influence was an empire of movement, mobility, and exchange. Normandy, named for the Northmen, would produce William the Conqueror, who remade England. The Kievan Rus, founded by Swedish traders and warlords, laid the foundation for modern Russia and Ukraine. In Sicily, Norman knights, descendants of Vikings, built palaces with Arabic arches and Christian mosaics, embodying a world stitched together by conquest and cultural borrowing alike. The prologue of their story, then, is not one of savagery alone. It is about how the geography of the North Sea and the Baltic became a springboard to global reach, how technological mastery of shipbuilding turned fjords into gateways rather than boundaries, and how restless populations transformed scarcity at home into opportunity abroad. When we peel back the myths and the medieval terror, what remains is a story of resilience and ambition. These were people who seized the margins of Europe and forced themselves into its heart, who tested the limits of known geography, and who carried with them not only steel, but stories, gods, and families. From the cloisters of Lindisfarne to the marble palaces of Constantinople, their sails were a shadow on the horizon that could mean destruction or new beginnings. They frightened, they fascinated, and they transformed. To understand how the Vikings actually conquered half the world is to see them not just as raiders, but as architects of a new interconnected age, one forged not only in fire and blood, but in trade, settlement, and the ceaseless daring of the human spirit. The Viking story begins in a landscape that both nurtured and constrained. Scandinavia in the 8th century was a world of long winters, short summers, and a patchwork of farmland scattered between forests, lakes, and fjords. The soil was thin, rocky, and difficult to till, its fertility often exhausted after only a few seasons. Harvests could fail, cattle might starve, and entire families were at the mercy of weather that shifted from bounty to famine without warning. Life here was possible, but precarious. Survival demanded resilience, innovation, and above all, a willingness to look beyond the horizon for what the land could not provide. Out of this environment grew a people whose lives were defined by movement and risk, whose children would one day sail further than any of their ancestors imagined. Geography shaped ambition. Norway's long, jagged coastline provided harbours and natural shipyards. But little farmland, the fjords, stunning in their scale, cut deep into the land, isolating communities and forcing reliance on the sea. Sweden's heartland, rich in forests and waterways, connected to the east through lakes and rivers that spilled into the Baltic, but its northern reaches were cold and unyielding. Denmark, with its gentler plains, could sustain larger populations. Yet even there, arable land was limited compared to the growing number of mouths to feed. When populations swelled, when families divided inheritance among too many sons, when new generations sought futures of their own, the answer often lay in boats and voyages rather than in staying rooted to soil that gave too little. This was the crucible of Viking expansion, a society on the edge of subsistence, skilled in the crafts of wood, metal, and navigation, honed by necessity to wring life from difficult terrain, now stood ready to turn its limitations into opportunities. Pressure at home combined with openings abroad, the collapse of old trade networks after the fall of Rome had left Europe fragmented, its wealth often concentrated in churches and monasteries that lacked strong defences. Meanwhile, the Abbasid Caliphate to the east generated an insatiable demand for furs, slaves, and other northern goods, paying in silver that transformed economies across Scandinavia. The timing was uncanny. At the very moment when Scandinavian populations needed outlets, the wider world offered both vulnerabilities and incentives. Climate played its part as well. The so-called medieval warm period, beginning in the 8th century, may have lengthened growing seasons slightly, but it also encouraged population growth that strained resources further. Expansion was no longer a choice, but a release valve. Younger sons, landless men, restless families, all were drawn into the logic of migration. Some left with the sword, seeking plunder to bring home. Others left with ploughs, axes, and livestock, prepared to clear fields in Ireland, Iceland, or the Orkneys. The Norse saw no contradiction between raiding and farming. Between building and burning, both were strategies for survival, shaped by the unforgiving conditions of the lands that birthed them. The fire in their story was not only metaphorical. Ironworking flourished in Scandinavia, with bog iron smelted into tools and weapons. The forests provided fuel for charcoal, the forges glowed hot, and smiths turned raw ore into ploughshares and spearheads alike. To master metal was to master both the earth and one's enemies. In villages scattered along coasts and valleys, workshops clanged with the sound of hammer on anvil. The weapons they made were more than instruments of war. They were symbols of identity, heirlooms passed between generations, marks of status in a society where honour and reputation could mean life or death. The forge and the fjord together defined the Norse, one supplying the tools of conquest, the other the highways upon which to launch them. It was also a society restless in spirit. Saga traditions and poetry hint at a culture that celebrated boldness, exploration, and the pursuit of fame beyond death. To leave home was not only practical, it was heroic. To die in battle, the Skald sang, was to dine in Valhalla. This valorization of risk did not create expansion by itself, but it gave cultural meaning to what economic necessity demanded. A voyage into the unknown could be cast as both survival strategy and sacred calling. Honour, wealth, and the favour of the gods intertwined, pushing the young and ambitious outward into the dangerous but rewarding world beyond the northern seas. By the 8th century, the pieces were in place. Geography created scarcity. Climate encouraged expansion. Technology provided the tools, and cultural values supplied the daring. Europe, beyond Scandinavia, was vulnerable and rich. The rivers of Russia beckoned with silver. The coasts of England with monasteries laden with treasures. The islands of the North Atlantic with land for farms. The fjords that hemmed in their homelands became launching points. Natural docks where ships could be built, stocked, and launched into the open sea. From hardship was born opportunity, and from constraint came the restless energy that would send longships from Baghdad to Newfoundland. The question of why then, why the Viking Age began around 750 and not centuries earlier, finds its answer in this convergence: population growth, new ship designs, international demand for northern goods, political fragmentation abroad, and the cultural valorization of adventure aligned in one moment of history. The spark of Lindisfarne's burning monastery was only the most visible sign of a deeper transformation. Scandinavia had reached the limits of its isolation. Its sons and daughters, born of fjords and fire, were about to burst across the known world. The Viking story cannot be told without the ships that carried it across oceans, rivers, and centuries. More than any sword or shield, It was the long, sleek hull of a vessel, drawn up on a beach that defined the Northman in the eyes of friend and foe alike. To see the dragon-proud silhouette against a dawn horizon was to know that events were about to change forever. These ships were not just tools of war or commerce, they were the very engines of Viking expansion, technological marvels that transformed geography into opportunity. Without them, fjords would have remained prisons of rock and ice. With them, the sea became a road to half the world. The genius of Viking shipbuilding lay in the principle of clinker construction. Planks overlapped like the scales of a fish, fastened with iron rivets, and caulked with wool or animal hair soaked in tar. This technique gave the hulls both strength and flexibility, allowing them to bend and sway with the waves rather than crack against them. Other cultures built ships as rigid boxes that fought the sea. The Norse built vessels that moved with it, dancing rather than resisting. This resilience made long voyages possible, from the choppy North Sea to the Atlantic rollers, and even the calmer but treacherous rivers of Russia. Equally important was the shallow draft. A Viking ship needed less than a metre of water to float fully laden. This meant that what looked like a war fleet could suddenly leave the open ocean, slide up a river, and appear without warning hundreds of kilometres inland. Cities like Paris and Seville, far from the coasts, discovered that no amount of distance from the sea could protect them. Armies could not be everywhere, but longships could. The same quality made escape easy. When a raid was finished, sails snapped taut and oars dipped, and the raiders were gone before a defending force could arrive. The terror of the Vikings lay not only in their ferocity, but in this unmatched mobility. The longship itself was an expression of this design philosophy. Long, narrow, and light, with high prow and stern, it could cut through waves at astonishing speed. Oars allowed steady progress when the wind faltered, and the great square sail, dyed with stripes of red or blue, carried the vessel swiftly when the breeze was fair. Crews could row for days if necessary, trading shifts at the benches, sleeping under the open sky, the ship itself doubling as transport, barracks, and weapon. The balance between sail and oar was critical. No other ship of its time could shift so seamlessly between the power of wind and the strength of men. But there were other vessels as well. The Nar, shorter and wider, was the workhorse of trade and settlement. While a longship might carry 60 warriors, a Nar carried livestock, timber, and barrels of grain. Its broader hull could endure the heavy swells of the North Atlantic, and its cargo space made colonization possible. Without Nars, there would be no Icelandic farmsteads, no Greenland settlements, no brief foray into the lands the sagas called Vinland. Where longships brought terror, Nars brought permanence. Together, they formed a symbiotic pair. One cleared the path, the other carried the lifeblood of new societies. Crafting such vessels was both art and science. Shipwrights chose oak for strength, pine for flexibility, birch for tar, and flax for rope. Timber had to be split, not sawn. To preserve the grain's integrity, every curve of the hull was shaped by eye, guided by generations of inherited knowledge rather than blueprints. A skilled master could see the lines of a finished ship in the trunk of a tree, selecting wood where nature had already curved it toward its purpose. The result was not mass production, but unique vessels, each with its own character, yet all sharing the same basic genius. Archaeology has given us glimpses of this world. The Gokstad ship, buried in Norway around 900, stretches 23 metres long, its clinker planks still smooth after a millennium underground. The Oseberg ship, buried even earlier with 2 women of wealth and power, reveals lavish carvings of interlaced beasts along its prow. These were not just machines of war, they were symbols of prestige, objects of beauty, and in some cases, vehicles for the dead into the afterlife. To be buried with a ship was the highest honour, a final voyage toward the halls of the gods. Speed was their greatest weapon. A well-crewed longship could cover 150 miles in a day, skimming over open sea, or up winding rivers faster than news could travel. By the time a warning reached inland villages, sails already loomed on the horizon. For trade, speed meant opportunity. Perishable goods could be transported quickly, and merchants could cross distances that would daunt slower caravans. For war, speed meant dominance. Entire armies could be transported, strike, and retreat before enemies could gather. The very unpredictability of where a longship might appear created a psychological edge that multiplied their effectiveness. It is tempting to think of these ships only as instruments of conquest, yet they were also instruments of connection. Along their benches sat men carrying not only weapons but also furs, walrus, ivory, amber, and slaves for markets in Constantinople and Baghdad. Women, too, travelled on Nars to new colonies, bringing weaving skills, livestock, and household gods to unfamiliar shores. These ships linked Scandinavia to a world economy that stretched from the North Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Silver coins minted in Samarkand ended up buried in Swedish soil, proof of the long threads spun by clinker-planked hulls. The sea was never simply a void to the Norse. It was a pathway. Their ships turned fjords from barriers into gateways, made islands into stepping stones, and rivers into highways. When we ask how a people from such marginal lands could thrust themselves into the heart of Europe, the answer is always the same. It was the ships. Without them, there is no Danelaw, no Kievan Ruses, no Greenland colonies. Without them, the Viking Age would have been no more than isolated raids on nearby coasts. With them, half the world became reachable. To stand on the prow of a longship as it surged across the waves must have been to feel invincible, carried by a craft that seemed alive in its speed and grace. The men who built them knew they were fashioning more than transport. They were building the vessels that would carry their names into history, that would carve fear into the prayers of monks and open markets that spanned continents. The longship and the Nar were not merely ships of wood and iron. They were ships of destiny, and in their wake lay the transformation of a world. To leave the sight of land in the 8th century was to step into a void that could swallow ships whole. No charts guided the way, no compasses pointed north, no satellites whispered coordinates from the heavens. Yet the Norse, with nothing but their eyes, their memory, and the signs of sea and sky, crossed distances that defied the imagination of their contemporaries. They reached Ireland, Greenland, and perhaps the coasts of North America, not by luck, but by a disciplined practice of wayfinding that turned the natural world into a map written in wind, water, and light. This was the compass of the mind, a set of skills honed over generations, where every sailor was both navigator and storyteller, weaving knowledge into survival. The sun was their most constant ally. When clouds broke, its angle offered direction, and a sailor could judge time and bearing by watching its path across the sky. Some sagas speak of a sunstone, a crystal that revealed the sun's position even in fog or twilight. Iceland's spar, a form of calcite, can polarize light, creating twin images of the sun's rays. By rotating the crystal until the beams matched, a navigator might locate the hidden sun's position. Whether myth or reality, such a tool would have been invaluable in the fog-draped North Atlantic. Yet even without it, the sailors knew the feel of morning and evening light, the shifting shadows cast on their decks, the difference between a sun climbing in the east and one sliding toward the west. By night, the stars stretched like road signs across the heavens. The North Star, fixed above the pole, was a lodestone for orientation, a point that seemed to hang immovable while the rest of the sky wheeled around it. The constellations carried names and stories that fixed them in memory, and a man who could read their positions could tell not only direction, but also the season, the hour, and his latitude. To steer by the stars was to trust the cosmos itself, a reliance as spiritual as it was practical, for the firmament was the roof of their mythology, where Odin and Thor looked down on mortal voyages. Closer to the sea, the waves themselves spoke, long before modern science. Norse sailors understood that swells travelled vast distances, rolling rhythmically from the directions of prevailing winds. By feeling the pitch of their vessel, by listening to the creak of timbers and the slap of water on hull, they could sense whether they were aligned with the great movements of the ocean. To the untrained, a sea might appear chaos. To them, it was a patterned language. Cross swells revealed nearby land masses as waves split and reformed around unseen coasts. The ocean, in their hands, became a living chart, one that shifted with weather but never ceased to offer clues. The natural world above the waves provided signals as well. Seabirds, especially species with short foraging ranges, revealed proximity to land. A gull or puffin, seen circling, meant that an island or coastline lay within a day's flight. Flocks at dawn or dusk showed direction, as birds commuted between nests and feeding grounds. Driftwood, seaweed, and even the smell of salt or vegetation on the wind could tell an attentive mariner more than any drawn chart. A shift in watercolour from deep blue to pale green announced shoals or shallow coastal shelves. To ignore such signs was to risk wreck and ruin. To read them was to survive. These techniques did not exist in isolation. They formed a mental web of associations, layered upon one another, cross-checked and memorized. A navigator's craft was not only technical, but mnemonic. He carried in his head the distances between landmarks, the angle of the sun at midsummer, the way the sky darkened when approaching Iceland, the smell of the Faroes in spring winds. Oral tradition preserved roots as stories. Sail for 3 days northwest until the birds vanish, then turn when the swell changes. Memory was chart, and chant was compass. In such a culture, the role of the helmsman was both practical and sacred, a keeper of knowledge without which the voyage would be blind. The courage to trust such methods was immense. A horizon at sea gives no hint of what lies beyond, and storms could erase every sign. Yet Norse crews launched themselves into open water, steering toward Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, with confidence born of accumulated skill. Failures surely came. Sagas speak of ships driven astray, of landfalls made by accident, but the overall pattern was one of mastery. Settlements in the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland did not happen by chance. They were the fruits of deliberate navigation, of minds disciplined to read a world without maps. This practice also reveals something deeper about their worldview. To navigate was to live in intimate dialogue with nature, to listen constantly to its cues. Unlike the rigid instruments of later ages, their tools were themselves alive birds, stars, waves, winds. In this sense, their seafaring was an extension of their mythology. The world was filled with signs and spirits, and the successful sailor was one who paid attention, who honoured the wisdom of his elders, and who kept faith with the gods who set stars in their courses. The compass of the mind was at once practical science and sacred trust. Archaeology and saga together give us glimpses of how refined this art became. Wooden sun compasses found in Greenland, marked with arcs to track shadows across the day, suggest that even crude instruments could reinforce mental calculations. Fragments of crystals hint at the possibility of sunstones, but these were aids, not replacements, for a body of knowledge woven into muscle and memory. The helmsman steering by tiller and the sailor adjusting the square sail were not consulting paper charts. They were listening, watching, and feeling 1,000 subtle signals that modern eyes might overlook. In the end, what stands out is not just the daring of their voyages, but the quiet, disciplined skill that made them possible. To sail from Norway to Greenland without sight of land for days required more than bravery. It required a way of thinking that mapped the invisible onto the mind's eye. Every bird, every star, every gust of wind was part of that invisible chart. In their hands, the sea ceased to be a blank expanse and became a web of signs, a navigable world rich with meaning. This was their compass, not of iron or magnet, but of memory and perception. It guided them across the northern seas, and through it, they carried their world into others. To speak of the Vikings is to gather together a patchwork of peoples whose identities were as complex as the lands they came from. They were not one tribe, not one nation, but Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes kin in language and culture, yet shaped by different landscapes and horizons. The Danes lived close to the rich pastures of Jutland and the narrow straits that linked the North Sea to the Baltic. Their ships pushed west and south toward England, Francia, and eventually the coasts of Iberia. The Norwegians, hemmed in by jagged mountains and fjords, looked outward to the open Atlantic. They sailed first to the Orkneys, then Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The Swedes, connected by inland lakes and rivers, turned east, slipping into the waterways that led to Novgorod, Kiev, and the Black Sea, where their descendants became rulers of Slavic lands under the name Rus. Together, they formed the restless force that Europe came to know simply as the Northmen. Within these societies, hierarchy ran deep, though not in the same rigid lines as the feudal kingdoms they encountered abroad. At the top stood the Jarls, the great lords, whose wealth lay in ships, land, and retainers sworn to their service. They led expeditions, presided at assemblies, and dispensed both justice and vengeance. Beneath them were the carls, the free farmers, and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Norse life. A carl's household might be modest, with a few acres, livestock, and a simple longhouse, or prosperous enough to send sons on voyages and host feasts in honour of neighbours. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved men and women, captured in raids or born into bondage. They laboured in the fields, tended herds, and rowed at the oars. Though a thrall could sometimes earn or be granted freedom, most lived and died in service to others. Yet all three classes, Jarl, Carl, Thrall, shared the same landscape, ate from the same sea, and contributed to the society that launched longships across half the world. Women held roles more varied than in many contemporary cultures. Norse law granted them the right to inherit property, to divorce husbands, and to reclaim their dowries. A widow could manage a farm, conduct trade, or commission a ship, just as any man might. While men sailed on expeditions, women kept the homesteads running, ensuring that food was stored, livestock tended, and kinship ties maintained. In the sagas, women urge vengeance, broker marriages, or speak prophetic truths. The figure of the shield maiden, while debated by historians, reflects this cultural memory of women not as passive figures, but as active participants in the dramas of honour and survival. Archaeological graves reveal women buried with weapons, as well as weaving tools, suggesting roles that defied simple categories. In the Longhouse, women wove the sails that carried ships abroad. In law and family, they held the threads that bound society together. Honour was the true currency of Viking life, a value more binding than coin or crown. To insult a man's reputation was to strike at his very being. Feuds could erupt from a careless word, a broken oath, or a spilled drink at a feast, yet there were systems for managing this volatile pride. At the heart of Norse law stood the Thing, the assembly of free men, where disputes were aired, laws recited, and judgments rendered. The Thing was both parliament and court, a place where collective memory preserved law in the mouths of chieftains and law speakers. Compensation, known as wergild, was a crucial part of this system. If one man killed another, he or his kin might pay a set sum to the victim's family, calculated by rank and status, to prevent blood feud. This balance between vengeance and payment reveals a society always teetering between chaos and order, bound together not by kings but by custom. The sagas tell us of men who refused settlement, who pursued vengeance until entire families were destroyed. They also tell of men who, through wise negotiation and generosity, won loyalty that endured for generations. To host a feast was to display wealth, but also to bind neighbours to you in webs of obligation. Gifts demanded counter-gifts. Hospitality created alliances. These ties of honour, law, and reciprocity meant that even in the absence of a strong state, society held together. Indeed, the Norse distrust of kingship is striking. While they could rally behind charismatic leaders, they prized independence and resisted permanent subjugation. Kings rose and fell quickly, checked by the power of Jarls, the voice of the Thing, and the readiness of free men to defend their rights. Religion wove through every layer of life. Odin, one-eyed seeker of wisdom, presided over poets and warriors alike. Thor, the hammer wielder, protected fields and families from the giants of chaos. Freya embodied fertility, prosperity, and love. The gods were not distant but present in daily ritual, in the pouring of ale as sacrifice, in the amulets worn around necks, in the oaths sworn before battle. Yet their myths also reflected the values of their worshippers. Courage in the face of doom, cunning as much as strength, the inevitability of fate, to live with honour in a world destined for Ragnarok. The final twilight of the gods was to embrace both the brevity and the glory of human life. This blend of pragmatism and belief shaped the Vikings into more than raiders. They were farmers who ploughed thin soil, traders who carried furs and amber, craftsmen who carved runes and forged steel, and poets who sang of glory. They were bound by law, yet ready for feud, capable of brutality, yet guided by codes of compensation and honour. Women could manage estates. Men could serve as mercenaries in foreign courts, and thralls could one day buy freedom. It was a society fluid enough to adapt, but structured enough to endure. When outsiders spoke of the Vikings, they saw only the raiders who came with fire and steel. But behind every raid stood a farm, a family, and a social fabric that made such ventures possible. Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes carried not only weapons, but their culture, their laws, and their sense of identity wherever their ships landed. To understand who the Vikings were is to look past the image of horned, helmeted marauders and see a people of farmers and poets, smiths and sailors, women and men bound by honour and shaped by hardship. Out of fjords and forests they came. But what they carried with them was not chaos alone. It was a way of life, as intricate as the knots they carved into wood and stone, that would leave its imprint on lands far from the cold north where it was born. The world of the Vikings was not one divided between the sacred and the ordinary, but one in which every field, fjord, and flame pulsed with divine presence. Their gods were not abstract, aloof beings, but figures woven into the fabric of daily life, invoked in oaths, feared in storms, thanked for harvests, and called upon before battle. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, hung himself upon the world tree Yggdrasil to win the secret of the runes, bleeding and suffering in order to seize wisdom for mankind. He was the god of poetry and kingship, of sorcery and secrets, the patron of those who sought not just brute strength, but cunning insight. Thor, broad-shouldered and quick to anger, stood as the protector of ordinary farmers and seafarers, his hammer, Mjolnir, crashing against the giants of chaos. Just as men wielded axes against invaders, Freyr and Freya governed fertility and love, prosperity and passion. Their blessings invoked in the planting of seeds and the binding of marriages. Loki, trickster and troublemaker, embodied the unsettling truth that mischief and malice were also part of the cosmic order. Yet belief did not end with the gods of Asgard. All around the Vikings, the land itself was alive with spirits, the Landvatir, guardians of forests, fields and shores. A sailor might bow to the shore before pulling his ship into harbour, lest he offend the unseen powers that governed safe passage. Farmers left offerings at boundary stones or burial mounds, ensuring that ancestors and spirits of place remained allies rather than foes. Even the dead were not gone, but active participants in the world of the living, inhabiting burial mounds, speaking in dreams, demanding proper rites. To neglect them was to invite misfortune. To honour them was to reinforce the bonds between generations. Rituals reflected this intimacy between human and divine. Sacrifices of animals, oxen, goats, horses were offered in great blots. Communal feasts where blood was sprinkled on altars, walls, and worshippers, sanctifying all with sacred power. The meat was then consumed in shared meals, binding community together under the eyes of the gods. Drinking rituals, too, carried spiritual weight, as horns were raised in toasts, not only to ancestors and chieftains, but to the gods themselves. The line between feast and prayer blurred, for to celebrate together was to renew social and spiritual bonds. Even the smallest gestures, a coin cast into a spring, a lock of hair placed in a grave, were acts of communication with forces unseen. The runes embodied this fusion of magic and meaning. More than an alphabet, they were thought to hold inherent power, symbols shaped from the order of the cosmos itself. To carve a rune was to participate in the creative force of the universe, to inscribe destiny as much as language. Runestones raised across Scandinavia stand as testaments not only to memory, but to magic. They proclaimed lineage, achievements and alliances, but their very presence along roads and waterways also invoked protection, commemoration, and even curses upon those who would defile them. Ordinary people may have known enough runes to scratch names or marks, but rune masters, steeped in lore, wielded them as tools of healing, binding, or harm. Poetry, too, was considered a form of magic. Skalds, the poets of the Viking courts, wielded words as warriors wielded steel. Their verses praised kings, preserved genealogies, and carried memory across generations. But they also possessed a sacred dimension. Odin himself had stolen the mead of poetry from giants, and every inspired verse was a taste of that divine drink. To speak in kennings, those elaborate, layered metaphors comparing ships to sea steeds or blood to battle sweat, was not simply literary flourish, but a way of seeing the world as interwoven with myth and power. A skald could make or break reputations. His words could travel farther than any sword's reach. Religion was not confined to ritual moments, but provided the emotional architecture of courage. To believe in Valhalla, where those who died in battle feasted eternally, was to march into combat without fear of death. to know that a warrior's fate was woven by the Norns. Spinning and cutting the threads of life was to accept the inevitability of one's end and to seek glory in how one met it. Honour became not a fragile human construct but a sacred duty, demanded by gods who watched from the high halls of Asgard. The promise of immortality through reputation and remembrance was both religious and social, binding men together in bonds of loyalty and shared purpose. At the same time, this worldview offered cohesion in a society without centralized states. Religion gave legitimacy to leaders, whose feasts and sacrifices demonstrated their role as intermediaries between gods and men. It gave meaning to hardships, explaining famine, storm, or defeat as consequences of divine will or neglected obligations. It reinforced law and custom, for oaths sworn upon Mjolnir or sacred rings bound men not just to each other, but before powers greater than themselves. To break such an oath was to risk more than social disgrace. It was to court the wrath of gods. Magic moved through this world as naturally as wind through sails. Seether, the shamanic practice, often associated with women, but not exclusively so, involved trance, prophecy, and manipulation of fate. Practitioners could bless or curse, foretell the outcome of battles, or summon storms. Such practices sat uneasily alongside more formal worship, for Seether was feared as much as respected, associated with both wisdom and unmanly deceit. Yet kings sometimes sought out seeresses, draped in cloaks and seated on high platforms, who spoke visions that guided politics as well as faith. The archaeological record confirms much of this complexity. Graves filled with weapons and horses suggest belief in an afterlife where such tools were needed. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, worn across Scandinavia and beyond, symbolized both religious devotion and cultural identity, sometimes even in deliberate contrast to the Christian crosses that began to appear. Buried boats, carrying the dead across the imagined seas of eternity, speak of a people who saw life and afterlife as continuous voyages. To understand the Vikings' courage is to see how belief fueled it. They were not reckless fools charging blindly into danger, but men and women whose worldview told them that life was brief, fate was fixed, and honour was eternal. To fight and die well was to achieve the only immortality that mattered. To build, trade, or settle was to leave memory carved in stone and story. Their gods, runes, and rituals did not sit apart from daily life, but saturated it, giving every act of courage, vengeance, or endurance a cosmic frame. Thus the Vikings sailed not only with swords and sails, but with faith. Faith in Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, Freya's bounty, and the unseen Landvatir beneath their feet. Faith in the runes carved on prows and the words sung in halls. Faith in a universe where even the end of all things was not to be feared, for Ragnarok itself promised renewal. This was the invisible cargo carried on every voyage, the unseen shield behind every raid and settlement. It was not just ships and steel that propelled them across seas. It was a belief system vast enough to hold both doom and hope, binding them together in a cosmos alive with meaning. When the dragon-proud ships appeared on the horizon, terror travelled faster than the wind. For coastal farmers and monks, the very shape of a longship's silhouette meant violence was near. What set the Vikings apart was not merely their willingness to raid, but the system of tactics they developed, refined, and repeated with precision. Their strategy was not conquest at first, but disruption, shock, and awe, an art of war born from mobility, surprise, and ruthless calculation. The hit-and-run raid was their signature. Longships skimmed across shallow waters where other vessels dared not sail, beaching directly on open shores or riverbanks, warriors leapt into action, striking villages, churches, and trading posts before defenders could muster, unlike lumbering armies that needed weeks of preparation. Viking crews could be on and off land in minutes. They took what was portable silver, livestock, grain, captives, and vanished before enemy horsemen or militias could gather. Entire kingdoms discovered that no fortress could guard every inlet. No patrol could match the speed of raiders who lived by the tides. Rivers became highways of terror and opportunity. The Seine, the Loire, the Thames, the Volga, all saw longships rowing far inland, their shallow drafts allowing passage where heavier ships would ground. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Places once thought immune to seaborne attack, Paris, Hamburg, Seville, suddenly found themselves under siege. Chains strung across rivers or fortified bridges might halt the advance. But Vikings adapted. They dismantled obstacles, hauled ships across land to bypass defences, or turned bottlenecks into opportunities to negotiate tribute. When Paris fell under siege in 845, its citizens paid thousands of pounds of silver to be spared, setting a precedent that would echo through decades of Viking campaigns. They did not always vanish with summer. Soon, they learned to winter in foreign lands, establishing fortified camps near rivers or coasts. These wintering bases allowed them to raid deeper, maintain pressure longer, and turn temporary plunder into lasting footholds. England's Danelaw was born not from a single invasion, but from this incremental shift. Raiders became settlers when seasons of war gave way to permanence. At Repton in 873, a Viking army made its camp within a ruined monastery, fortifying the site with ditches and ramparts. From such strongholds they could both raid and negotiate, forcing kingdoms to confront them not as fleeting raiders, but as enduring occupiers. Hostages formed another instrument of strategy. More than plunder, hostages were leveraged living guarantees of treaties, payments, and submission. A captured noble or bishop could restrain an entire kingdom, forcing rulers to comply with demands lest the hostage be mutilated or executed. Sometimes hostages became ransom, their freedom purchased in coin or land. At other times, they were absorbed into Viking households, their identities reshaped by Norse culture, their loyalties severed from the communities that had surrendered them. The taking of hostages turned every negotiation into a balance of fear, where even defeated enemies remained bound by the grip of the raiders. Viking warfare thrived on flexibility. They did not rely on heavy cavalry or fixed formations, but fought as bands of experienced fighters, used to the sudden clash of shield walls. They could storm a monastery with axes and torches, or form disciplined ranks against an army in the field. Their ability to adapt to circumstance to fight in open battle, ambush convoys, or conduct sieges meant they never fit neatly into the categories of barbarian raiders or professional armies. They were both, depending on what the moment required. The terror they inspired was part of the strategy. Monks recorded their raids with phrases that carried the weight of apocalyptic dread. The heathen are at the gates. The sea vomits forth serpents. The very memory of Lindisfarne's sacking in 793 spread across Christendom like wildfire, magnifying the reputation of raiders far beyond their actual numbers. Fear itself became a weapon. Towns surrendered before the fight began. Rulers paid tribute to avoid destruction, and traders bought safety with silver. For the Vikings, reputation was as powerful as steel. But theirs was not chaos without thought. Every raid was calculated. They learned to strike during religious festivals, when churches were full of worshippers and treasuries unlocked. They struck when rivers were high in spring, when mobility was greatest. They avoided protracted battles that drained manpower, preferring swift strikes and strategic withdrawals. Over time, their methods hardened into a system, a way of war that made small bands of raiders capable of destabilizing kingdoms and extracting immense wealth from their neighbors. Yet even their violence had limits. The Vikings knew that devastation alone could not sustain them. Tribute demanded fear. But it also required trust, that kings who paid would not be betrayed, that negotiated truces would hold at least long enough for both sides to regroup. In this way, warfare became diplomacy, and raids became negotiations, written in blood and silver. To fight was to communicate as much as to destroy, and to terrify was to create leverage. The brilliance of Viking tactics lay in their simplicity, fueled by ships that turned every coast and river into an open door. From Ireland to Russia, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the rhythm repeated: appear suddenly, strike fiercely, vanish swiftly, return when least expected. Each campaign layered new lessons onto the old, refining a playbook that made them the most feared seaborne warriors of their age. Theirs was not brute savagery, but a system of calculated disruption that reshaped the political and economic map of Europe. To those who faced them, it felt like chaos descending from the sea. To the Vikings themselves, it was order of another kind, flexible, opportunistic, rooted in skill and sharpened by hunger for wealth and renown. They wielded not only axes and fire, but surprise, mobility, and reputation, turning the oceans into theatres of fear. Their shock and awe at sea was not only how they fought, it was how they remade the world's imagination of what war could be. The windswept island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, had long been a sanctuary of prayer and learning, a place where monks copied manuscripts in silence, where relics were venerated, and where the rhythm of the tides seemed to mirror the rhythm of their prayers. In June of 793, that quiet world was shattered when dragon-prowed ships appeared from the sea. The raiders who poured onto the shore were not kings or armies of conquest, but a relatively small band of Norsemen seeking silver, slaves, and glory. Yet their attack on this holy site reverberated across Europe, far beyond the immediate destruction. Lindisfarne became not merely a raid but a symbol, the spark that ignited the image of the Viking terror that would haunt Christendom for centuries. To understand why, one must consider what the monastery represented. Monastic sites in early medieval Europe were not only centres of spirituality but treasuries of concentrated wealth. Land donations from kings and nobles had filled their storehouses with grain, livestock, and precious objects given in devotion. Altars gleamed with gold and silver, reliquaries held priceless fragments of saints' bones, and manuscripts bound in fine leather preserved sacred knowledge. And unlike royal fortresses or urban centres, monasteries were rarely defended. Their walls were symbolic, not martial, their inhabitants trained in prayer, not war. In a world where wealth was often scattered in peasant villages or tightly guarded in castles, monasteries stood out as soft targets brimming with treasure. For the Vikings, Lindisfarne was both opportunity and experiment. They had raided before in smaller, less remembered strikes along the coasts of Britain and the Franks, but here they chose a site of extraordinary symbolic value. The shock was not only in the violence, the slaughter of monks, the desecration of altars, the plundering of relics, but in the violation of the sacred. The chroniclers struggled to explain what had happened. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle spoke of heathen men laying waste to God's house. Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar in Charlemagne's court, wrote despairingly that never before had such terror come to Britain, blaming the sins of the people for provoking divine punishment. For the Christian imagination, The attack was not just a raid, but a cosmic warning, an omen that God's protection had been withdrawn. In practical terms, Lindisfarne was no more significant than many other coastal settlements the Vikings struck, but in perception, it was transformative. Monks recorded history, and it was their pens that etched the Norsemen into the consciousness of Europe as agents of chaos and wrath. They described not merely loss of wealth, but the violation of the holy. Portraying the raiders as devils vomited from the sea, the narrative spread faster and further than any band of ships could travel. Magnifying the terror, Lindisfarne became shorthand for vulnerability, proof that no place, however sacred, was safe from northern sails. The raid also demonstrated the precision of Viking intelligence. Lindisfarne lay near trading routes, and Norse sailors would have known of its riches from merchants or earlier scouts. Its location was accessible to shallow-drafted ships, allowing a swift strike and retreat. This was no random act of savagery, but a calculated blow against one of the most prestigious monasteries in Britain. The careful choice of target ensured not only immediate plunder, but a shockwave of fear that far outweighed the raiders' numbers. From that moment forward, Viking ceased to be a vague label for northern wanderers and became synonymous with terror from the sea. Kings and bishops realized their coasts were exposed, their spiritual centers vulnerable, their political systems unprepared. Tribute payments and fortifications would follow. But in 793, the raiders revealed how brittle the defences of Christian Europe truly were. Fear itself became a new currency. If a handful of ships could devastate Lindisfarne, what might a fleet do to London, Rouen, or Paris? The imagination of danger multiplied the practical threat 100-fold. For the Norse themselves, the raid's notoriety was part of the reward. Viking honour culture valued reputation as highly as silver. To be feared across kingdoms was to wield power before ever raising a sword. Word of Lindisfarne's plunder spread back across the North Sea, inspiring others to build ships and test their fortune. The monastery's ruins were not only a monument to destruction, but an advertisement of opportunity. In this way, the raid fueled the cycle of expansion. More warriors sought glory, more ships set sail, more rulers trembled at their arrival. The PR war, though unintentional, was decisive. Monks, in their outrage, broadcast the terror of the event, and in doing so, elevated the raiders into legendary enemies. They transformed a pragmatic raid into an existential threat to Christian society. For generations, every dragon-headed prow that cut across the waves recalled Lindisfarne. Every coastal settlement heard echoes of its bells silenced by fire. The Norse had found not only a strategy of plunder, but a strategy of fear, magnified by the very voices that cursed them. Thus, Lindisfarne endures in memory not simply as the first great Viking raid, but as the moment when Europe's perception of safety collapsed. The wealth of the monastery was stripped, the bodies of monks desecrated, the relics scattered, but the true impact was psychological. A handful of men in longships had shown that oceans were no longer barriers but bridges for violence. From that day forward, Christendom looked outward with dread, scanning horizons for the sails of the north. The Viking Age had begun not only in blood but in story, and the story proved as powerful as the raid itself. The first Viking ships that scraped England's shores in the late 8th century came as predators, snatching silver and captives before vanishing into the mist. But over the course of 2 centuries, these raids hardened into something else entirely: the transformation of piracy into polity, of fleeting violence into permanent rule. England became the crucible where Viking ambition shifted from loot to lordship, leaving behind scars and structures that reshaped the island forever. The first decades were marked by opportunism. Monasteries like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Iona were plundered. and coastal communities lived under the constant threat of sudden violence. By the mid-9th century, however, the nature of these incursions changed. The arrival of what chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army in 865 was unlike anything seen before. This was not a single raid, but a coalition of warbands. Hundreds of ships disgorging thousands of warriors, led by figures like Ivar, the Boneless, Halfdan, Ragnarsson, and Uber. They wintered in East Anglia, demanding tribute, horses, and supplies. Unlike their predecessors, they did not return north when summer ended. They came to stay. Their campaign unfolded as a relentless march across the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria was struck first, its capital York captured in 866. Its rival dynasties swept aside, Mercia bent under pressure, its rulers forced into submission. East Anglia was overrun, its king martyred for refusing to renounce his faith. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written from the English perspective, recorded these events with dread, whole kingdoms collapsing in the face of armies who seemed to multiply from the sea. Yet the Viking leaders were not mindless destroyers. They parcelled out land, founded bases, and turned plunder into power. The Danelaw emerged from this expansion, a swath of eastern and northern England under Scandinavian control, where Viking law, customs, and settlement patterns transformed the landscape. Life in the Danelaw revealed the deeper ambitions of the invaders. They were not content with silver alone. Scandinavian settlers ploughed fields, raised livestock, and intermarried with local populations. Towns like York became thriving centres of trade and craftsmanship, humming with markets where Arabic coins, Frankish wine, and northern furs changed hands. Place names across eastern England still bear witness. Villages ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaite mark the footprint of Norse farmers who turned raided land into permanent homes. The boundary between conqueror and settler blurred, and within a generation, the Danelaw was no longer an occupied zone, but a new cultural landscape. Against this transformation rose Alfred of Wessex, remembered as the Great. In 878, at the darkest moment of his reign, Alfred fled into the marshes of Somerset after Guthrum's forces overran much of his kingdom. Yet from this low point he rallied, reorganising defences and meeting the Vikings at Edington. There, Alfred's victory forced Guthrum to accept baptism and retreat into the Danelaw. This was no final triumph, but it marked the beginning of a long reconquest. Alfred's genius lay less in battlefield glory than in structural reform. He reorganised his kingdom's military obligations, creating a system of fortified towns burst spaced strategically across Wessex. Each was manned by garrisons, supplied by surrounding lands, and connected by roads, creating a defensive web that blunted the advantage of Viking mobility. For the first time, the English had a system resilient enough to resist constant raids. Alfred also understood the war of culture. He sponsored translations of Latin texts into Old English, promoted literacy, and cast himself as a king of both sword and book. By strengthening the identity of his people, he offered a counterweight to the Norse cultural infiltration of the Danelaw. Where the Vikings had sought to normalise their presence, Alfred sought to unify resistance under a common heritage of law, learning, and faith. His successors built upon this foundation, gradually pressing the frontier of the Danelaw back toward the North Sea. Edward the Elder and Athelstan extended Wessex's authority over Mercia and Northumbria, forging the idea of a single kingdom of England. Athelstan's victory at Brunanburh in 937, against a coalition of Norse, Scots, and Britons, was celebrated in verse as the moment England itself was born. Yet Viking power did not disappear. It adapted, even as English kings consolidated. Scandinavian fleets returned, now larger, more organised, and often under the command of ambitious monarchs seeking dominion across seas. The 10th and early 11th centuries witnessed a cycle of invasion, tribute, and conquest as English rulers paid Danegeld massive sums of silver to buy temporary peace. These payments, intended to prevent raids, often encouraged more as word spread of England's vast wealth. For the Norse, England became not just a target, but a prize, a realm worth ruling outright. This ambition reached its peak under Canute the Great, a Danish prince who conquered England in 1016 after years of struggle between native kings and Viking challengers. Canute did what earlier warlords had not. He turned conquest into stable kingship. Crowned at London, he ruled not as a foreign occupier, but as a king in the English tradition, respecting laws, supporting the church, and integrating himself into the realm's governance. At the same time, his authority extended across the North Sea, uniting England, Denmark, and later Norway in what has been called the North Sea Empire. For a brief moment, the waters that had once borne raiders became the connective tissue of a realm larger and richer than any single Scandinavian kingdom had ever dreamed. Canute's reign represented the culmination of 2 centuries of transformation. The Vikings, who had once come to burn and pillage, now sat on thrones, issued law codes, and endowed churches. England had been reshaped by their presence, linguistically, with Norse words entering Old English, socially, with intermarriage binding communities, politically, with institutions forged in the fires of resistance and conquest. The terror of Lindisfarne had given way to the administration of an empire. When Canute's dynasty faltered after his death in 1035, the North Sea Empire collapsed, and England slipped back into the contest of native and foreign claimants. Yet the precedent remained. Viking energy had not only reshaped England's borders, but had accelerated the very idea of centralised kingship. What began as piracy had become polity, and in the crucible of England, the Vikings revealed their true capacity, not just for destruction, but for creation. Out of raids came realms, and out of chaos came the strange, enduring legacy of Scandinavian rule. When the dragon-headed ships first pushed up the broad rivers of Francia, they found a land both rich and fractured. The Carolingian Empire, nominally mighty under the shadow of Charlemagne's legacy, had splintered into rival courts, overburdened peasants, and overstretched defences. Rivers like the Seine and the Loire became watery highways that led straight to the heart of towns, monasteries, and cities. Viking longships, with their shallow drafts, glided past reed banks and under wooden bridges, bringing terror to places that had never before feared attack from the sea. In 845, Paris itself felt the full weight of this new power. Ragnar, whether a legendary amalgam or a historical warlord, sailed with a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine, sacked monasteries along the way, and forced the city into submission. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, capitulated, paying an enormous ransom in silver. Thus began a cycle that would define Francia's relationship with the Norse: tribute in exchange for peace, a grim economy known as Dangeld. The Vikings quickly realised that their reputation was worth as much as their blades. Raids were violent, but the greatest profits often came without fighting. The mere sight of ships could induce towns to open their gates and rulers to open their treasuries. Tribute became institutionalised, a line in royal budgets, a grudging acknowledgement that the Franks could not patrol every waterway, nor muster troops with the speed needed to intercept fast-moving fleets. For the Vikings, this system was as reliable as harvest. Silver flowed northward, feeding economies in Denmark and Norway, where tribute silver was melted into ingots or hacked into pieces for exchange. But the Danegeld was never enough. Tribute brought temporary respite, not loyalty. Once a payment was exhausted, raiders returned. The cycle of silver and fire eroded Frankish stability, and the empire's fractured heirs could rarely coordinate a unified response. The Loire Valley became a playground for Scandinavian fleets, who established bases on islands from which they launched repeated strikes. Nantes, Angers, Tours, all endured the torch. Monasteries that had stood for centuries collapsed in ash. Paris itself, besieged again in 885, endured a massive Viking encampment that lasted through winter. The defenders held on, but only with enormous suffering and the eventual negotiation of yet more payments. The chroniclers who recorded these disasters saw them as divine punishment. But behind the laments, one can glimpse the cold pragmatism of Viking strategy. They pushed as far inland as resistance allowed, extracted wealth, then withdrew or settled when the balance favoured it. Settlement was the next phase. Raiding bands began to linger in the valleys, taking wives, farming land, and integrating into the local fabric. It was no longer only about silver, but about permanence. The Norse adapted quickly, recognizing that Francia offered not just treasure, but fertile soil and political opportunity. The greatest of these opportunities came in the early 10th century, when a warlord named Rollo, likely of Norwegian origin, but seasoned in raids across the Seine, made a decisive bargain with the Frankish crown. Charles the Simple, desperate to secure the Seine Valley against further devastation, offered Rollo legitimacy in exchange for loyalty. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 granted Rollo and his men land around Rouen. In return, Rollo pledged to defend the region against other Viking bands and to accept baptism, binding him nominally to the Christian order of Europe. It was a compromise born of exhaustion, yet it proved one of the most consequential deals of the medieval world. From this pragmatic arrangement was born Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo and his successors did not remain outsiders for long. They married into Frankish aristocracy, adopted the French language, and converted to Christianity. Yet they preserved their martial traditions, their seafaring instincts, and their hunger for expansion. Within a generation, the Normans were both Frankish lords and Viking heirs, wielding a hybrid identity that made them formidable. The Duchy of Normandy became a bastion of disciplined warriors, a laboratory where Norse energy fused with Frankish feudalism. The tribute economy of the 9th century had thus evolved into something far more stable. Instead of paying endless Danegeld to stave off destruction, the Franks had effectively outsourced defence of their own river valleys to the very raiders who had once plundered them. Normandy grew into a power base that could project influence outward, shaping not only the politics of France, but eventually the destiny of England and the Mediterranean. In Rouen stone halls, the children of Vikings and Franks plotted campaigns that would echo as far as Sicily and the Levant. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. What began as terror from the sea ended as a duchy integral to the Frankish political order. The men who had desecrated churches now endowed monasteries. The raiders who had once demanded tribute now collected taxes as lords. The very system meant to contain them had instead institutionalized their presence, ensuring that Viking power would endure in new, unexpected forms. In Francia, the story of the Vikings was not simply one of violence and resistance, but of transformation. Danegeld revealed the vulnerability of kingdoms, the inability of rulers to protect every frontier, but it also created opportunities for settlement, legitimacy, and integration. Normandy stood as the most visible symbol of that transformation. A duchy born of fire and ransom, hardened by the sword, yet legitimized by treaty and baptism. From the Seine's muddy waters to the polished stone of Rouen cathedrals, the arc of Viking power in Francia showed how plunder became polity, how raiders became rulers, and how the terror of the North was woven into the fabric of medieval Europe. The Irish Sea in the 9th century was a crossroads of opportunity, and no group exploited it more fully than the Vikings. When their longships first carved their wakes across its waters, they found a land divided among countless small kingdoms, each ruled by rival chieftains and bound by fragile alliances. Unlike England or Francia, Ireland lacked a single unifying crown, and that fractiousness made it fertile ground for Viking ambition. Rather than marching inland to subjugate entire realms, the Norse focused on the coasts and rivers, inserting themselves into the fractured mosaic of Gaelic politics. Out of this strategy emerged fortified enclaves, longforts that reshaped Ireland and gave the Norse lasting footholds in the archipelago of the Irish Sea. A longfort was more than a camp. The term, meaning ship fort, described temporary defensive enclosures set up along navigable rivers or estuaries. At first, these were wooden palisades ringed around beached ships, bases from which raiders could strike monasteries and retreat to safety. But quickly they evolved into permanent settlements, nodes of trade and power that transformed raiders into rulers. Dublin, founded in 841, became the most famous of these sites. Its location on the River Liffey, perfect for both inland raids and maritime commerce. What began as a Viking stronghold grew into a bustling town, a hub where Norse and Gaelic worlds collided. Dublin's markets pulsed with an economy that reached far beyond Ireland. Slaves were its most infamous commodity, captives taken from raids in Ireland, Wales, and even as far as England and Scotland were sold in great numbers, bound for markets as distant as Al-Andalus and the Abbasid Caliphate. This grim trade enriched Dublin's rulers, who turned human suffering into silver. Alongside slaves came furs, walrus ivory, and crafted goods, exchanged for silver dirhams from the east and luxury goods from the continent. The silver that poured into Dublin not only filled hoards, but fueled a new economic order in the Irish Sea, linking Gaelic Ireland to global currents of wealth. Yet the Vikings were never simply outsiders. Intermarriage, alliance, and adaptation created a new Norse Gaelic culture that blurred distinctions between settler and native. Norse rulers took Gaelic wives. Gaelic chieftains allied with Norse warlords against their rivals. The sagas speak of kings with Norse fathers and Gaelic mothers, men who embodied two traditions at once. In art, archaeology reveals hybrid styles, brooches combining Norse motifs with Celtic patterns, swords inscribed with runes alongside Gaelic names, even language fused, with place names around Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick reflecting the melding of tongues. The political landscape of Ireland absorbed these new powers into its existing rivalries. Viking leaders became one more faction among many, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies of Gaelic kings. Norse fleets fought alongside Irish armies in battles for supremacy, their ships decisive in river crossings or coastal assaults. At Clontarf in 1014, the culmination of these centuries of entanglement, Norse Gaelic Dubliners fought both with and against Gaelic kings in a clash that revealed how fully the Viking presence had become part of Ireland's own civil wars. Beyond Ireland itself, and control of the Irish sea trade lanes gave the Norse a strategic advantage. From Dublin, fleets could reach the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and the western coasts of Britain with ease. These islands became stepping stones, bases for fleets that linked Norway, Scotland, and Ireland into a single maritime system. The Isle of Man, in particular, emerged as a crucial hub, its central location making it the keystone of the Norse Gaelic Sea Empire. Kings of Dublin often extended their authority over the island, using it to project power across the sea lanes. The rhythms of trade and war in the Irish Sea tied these places together into a coherent Norse Gaelic world. The fusion was not merely political or economic, but spiritual. Pagan practices lingered long in the Norse enclaves, even as Christianity spread through intermarriage and diplomacy. Burial mounds in Dublin's outskirts show warriors interred with swords and Thor's hammers, while churches rose within the town's walls. The coexistence of runes and crosses captures the cultural negotiation underway. In time, Norse settlers became Christians, but their sense of identity remained distinct, blending Gaelic piety with Scandinavian pragmatism. The Viking longforts changed the very idea of urban life in Ireland. Before their arrival, Ireland had few true towns. Political and religious centres were largely monastic or royal sites. The Norse brought the concept of market towns permanent centres, where trade, craft, and administration coalesced. Dublin, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, and Wexford all trace their origins to these ship forts turned towns. The urban map of modern Ireland bears the imprint of Viking pragmatism, proof that their settlements endured long after the longships ceased to raid. By embedding themselves in Ireland's fractious politics, controlling the slave and silver economy, and fusing with Gaelic culture, the Vikings created something more than colonies. They created a Norse Gaelic civilization that spanned the Irish Sea, a maritime commonwealth of warriors, traders, and kings. The Irish annals may have recorded their arrival as a storm from the sea, but over time, the storm became a current, shaping the flow of Ireland's history. What began as opportunistic, raiding from ship forts, had become a lasting transformation. Dublin was no longer merely a Viking base, but one of the most important towns in the archipelago. The Norse had not conquered Ireland outright. They had done something subtler, embedding themselves into its networks of power and trade until they were inseparable from them. Through longforts, slave markets, and silver flows, they made the Irish Sea their dominion, and in doing so, they forged a hybrid identity that would outlast the Viking Age itself. The dense forests and wide waterways of the eastern Baltic concealed opportunities as rich as any monastery in the West. For the Swedes who looked eastward, the land across the Gulf of Finland and beyond the Great Lakes of Russia was not simply a frontier, but a corridor. Rivers laced through the landscape like veins, carrying furs, wax, honey, and above all, slaves down toward markets that stretched to Byzantium and Baghdad, where Norwegians carved paths across the North Atlantic and Danes struck into the North Sea. The Swedes became masters of the inland seas and river highways, turning their longships into caravans that stitched Scandinavia into the vast networks of Eurasia. From these expeditions would emerge a new political formation, the Rus. The eastward movement began as trade, but quickly took on the dimensions of conquest. Swedish war bands, known as Varangians, pressed into the Gulf of Finland, up the Neva, and along the Volkhov to Lake Ilmen. There, the settlement of Novgorod rose as their first great base, a fortified emporium where Scandinavian merchants and Slavic tribes intersected. From Novgorod, the Dnieper lay open, and with it, the road to Kiev and the Black Sea. These waterways formed what later chroniclers called the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a lifeline of commerce that connected pine forests and steppe pastures to Constantinople's gilded domes. The mechanics of this expansion were as much about diplomacy and tribute as about battle. Norse warbands demanded payments from the Slavic and Finnic tribes they encountered, sometimes in kind, sometimes in slaves, sometimes in silver. These arrangements, though exploitative, also provided security along the trade routes. In return for tribute, the Varangians defended merchants from rival raiders and settled disputes. Over time, these armed traders became rulers in their own right. Their dominance formalized into early states. The primary chronicle, written centuries later, describes the invitation of the Varangian prince Rurik to rule over the quarrelling Slavs, a story that likely reflects a gradual process by which Scandinavian leaders inserted themselves into the fabric of local politics. Kiev, established further south on the Dnieper, became the jewel of this system. Whoever held it controlled the crucial portages and rapids along the river, the gateway to the Black Sea. From Kiev, the Rus could threaten Constantinople itself, as when fleets of hundreds of longships appeared before the Theodosian walls in the 860s and again in the 10th century. Byzantine chroniclers recorded the terror of these sudden northern armadas, their sails darkening the sea, their warriors demanding tribute. Yet the Byzantines were pragmatic. After the shock of raids came the formality of treaties. Rus's envoys signed agreements that secured trading rights in Constantinople, allowing them to exchange their northern goods for Byzantine wine, silk, and coin. In this way, raids became the prelude to commerce, and terror the lever of negotiation. The eastern route connected not only to Byzantium, but further still to the Islamic world. Silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate flooded northward, carried up the Volga by merchants and warbands alike. Excavations in Sweden have uncovered tens of thousands of these coins, buried in hoards across Gotland and beyond, mute testimony to the scale of this trade. The demand for slaves in Islamic markets was a central driver. Slavic captives, whose very name would give rise to the word slave in European tongues, were transported in staggering numbers, chained and marched downriver to be sold in far-off cities like Baghdad. Alongside human lives went furs, amber, and honey, commodities of the northern forests exchanged for silver that underpinned Scandinavian economies. The fusion of Norse and Slavic cultures in the east gave the Rus their distinctive identity. Archaeology reveals warrior graves with both Scandinavian swords and Slavic ornaments, settlements where runic inscriptions mingle with Slavic names, and burial practices that combine cremation with inhumation. Over generations, the Norse elite intermarried with local populations, adopted Slavic languages, and eventually converted to Christianity under Prince Vladimir in 988. What began as a Norse venture became something new, a hybrid polity that drew from both the Baltic and the steppe, both Odin's halls and Byzantine liturgy. Yet in the earliest centuries, the Russes remained very much a Viking enterprise. Their rulers were Scandinavian warlords, their fleets crewed by men who navigated rapids by portaging ships across land, their treaties sealed with the authority of warriors who could both burn cities and defend them. The reputation of the Varangians extended beyond their own realm. Byzantine emperors came to recruit them as mercenaries, forming the elite Varangian Guard that would stand at the heart of imperial power in Constantinople. Tall, axe-wielding men from Sweden and beyond guarded the emperor himself, a symbol of how far the reach of the Rus and their Scandinavian kin had extended. The Baltic, often overshadowed by the drama of the North Sea raids, was thus the cradle of a different Viking achievement, the creation of a transcontinental state. The Swedes did not merely plunder but organize trade routes, demanded tribute, and established urban centers that became the seeds of medieval Russia and Ukraine. Novgorod and Kiev were not just way stations, but cities of enduring significance, their origins rooted in the ambitions of men who left the fjords to follow the currents of the east. This transformation from raiders to rulers, from Varangian bands to the Russ's polity, illustrates the adaptability that defined the Viking Age. The same skills that carried longships to Paris or Dublin carried them up the Volga and the Dnieper. The same willingness to mix violence and negotiation that wrung Danegeld from Frankish kings secured treaties with Byzantine emperors. The eastward Swedes created not merely a chapter in Viking history, but a new axis of medieval Eurasia, binding the forests of the north to the riches of the south. In this way, the Baltic was not a barrier, but a bridge, and the rivers beyond it became the arteries of a Norse empire in all but name. The Russes emerged as both Scandinavian and Slavic, northern and southern, raiders and rulers. Their story reveals how the Vikings did not conquer half the world by brute force alone, but by inserting themselves into its networks of power, trade, and culture, from the icy Gulf of Finland to the golden domes of Constantinople. The wake of their ships redrew the map of medieval Europe. They came to Constantinople not as invaders, but as men for hire, drawn by the promise of pay and prestige in the richest city of the medieval world. For the Norsemen who had cut their way down the Dnieper and through the Black Sea, the Byzantine capital was both a prize and a partner. At first, they arrived in fleets that tested the city's walls, demanding tribute or threatening plunder. But soon, a different relationship emerged. The emperors of Byzantium, ever wary of the intrigues of their own Greek and Armenian aristocrats, found in these northern warriors the perfect antidote, a core of loyal foreigners with no stake in local politics. Thus the Varangian Guard was born, transforming Vikings into the empire's most feared and trusted soldiers. To enter Constantinople was to step into another world. The mosaics glittered with gold, the streets bustled with silks and spices, and the walls rose higher than any fortification the Norse had seen. For a man who had grown up in a wooden hall on the edge of a fjord, the metropolis must have seemed like a vision from the sagas. Yet the Varangians were not overawed. They brought with them the discipline of the ship and the ferocity of the shield wall, qualities that emperors recognized could be turned to their advantage. Recruited in large numbers, first from the Rus and later from Scandinavia and even Anglo-Saxon England after 1066, the Varangians became the personal bodyguards of the emperor, their loyalty sealed with oaths and lavish pay. Their weapon of choice was the great two-handed axe, a weapon that symbolized their foreignness as much as their skill. Byzantine chroniclers noted their height, their blonde or red hair, and the way they swung their axes with devastating effect. In battle, they were shock troops, deployed at critical moments to break enemy lines or defend the imperial standard. In peacetime, they stood at the emperor's side in ceremonies, their glittering armour and imposing stature reminding all who watched that the throne was shielded by men who feared no intrigue and spoke no Greek. Their very foreignness was their strength. Service in the Varangian Guard was both lucrative and honourable. Soldiers were paid in solid gold, a wage far above what they could expect in the north. After years of service, many returned home with wealth enough to build great halls, fund expeditions, or establish dynasties. Silver and silk, coins stamped with the emperor's face, and exotic goods from across the empire flowed back to Scandinavia through these veterans, transforming not only their fortunes, but their culture. In burial mounds across Sweden and Norway, archaeologists have uncovered Byzantine coins, jewellery, and even religious icons, tokens of the exchange that passed along this human pipeline of mercenary service. But not all returned. Many remained in Byzantium, marrying local women, settling into the empire's cosmopolitan fabric, and passing down memories of their northern heritage. The sagas preserve stories of men who fought for years in the south, earning renown that rivaled any hero of the fjords. One such figure was Harald Hardrada, who before becoming king of Norway spent a decade in the Varangian Guard. His adventures read like an epic. Battles across the Mediterranean, riches amassed in imperial service, and a reputation forged in the crucible of Byzantium's endless wars. When he finally returned north, it was with both wealth and experience that marked him as a figure of destiny, a king moulded by the empire he had once served. The presence of the Varangians also flowed the other way, leaving its imprint on Byzantium itself. Northern fighting styles, weaponry, and even attitudes toward personal loyalty influenced the empire's military culture. The Byzantines, masters of diplomacy and strategy, learned from the raw energy of their northern guards, while the Varangians absorbed the sophistication of Byzantine tactics, siegecraft, and organization. It was a two-way exchange. Norsemen gained a vision of empire, bureaucracy, and wealth far beyond anything in their homelands, while Byzantium gained the muscle and ferocity of men who lived for battle. Culturally, too, the exchange was profound. Norse mercenaries encountered Christianity in its most opulent and intellectual form. The soaring liturgy of Hagia Sophia, the procession of relics, and the power of icons impressed upon them a new understanding of faith. Many returned north not only with gold but with crosses, relics, and stories of a faith that mingled awe with grandeur. This exposure to Byzantine Christianity played a role in the gradual conversion of Scandinavia, its imagery and prestige carried back by men who had seen the emperor himself kneel before the altar. The Varangians also carried tales homeward, sagas of Constantinople called Miklagard. The great city filtered into Scandinavian lore. They spoke of walls that stretched to the sky, of streets where markets overflowed with goods from India, Africa, and the Silk Road, of emperors who could summon fleets larger than the greatest Viking armada. For the Norse world, Byzantium became a symbol of power and wealth, a place where fortunes could be made and reputations sealed. The Guard endured for centuries, a living reminder of the Viking Age long after the last longship had been hauled ashore. Even when Scandinavia itself had converted, centralized, and begun to resemble its European neighbors, men still sought service in Byzantium. By the 11th century, Anglo-Saxon warriors dispossessed after the Norman conquest joined their Scandinavian cousins, swelling the ranks with exiles who found in the emperor's service both refuge and purpose. They, too, became part of the Varangian mystique, wielding axes in defense of a throne far from their homeland. In the end, the Varangian Guard symbolized the Vikings' greatest strength, their ability to insert themselves into the currents of global power. They did not need to conquer Constantinople to make it theirs. They became part of its very fabric by offering what they had in abundance, courage, loyalty, and skill with arms. In return, they gained not only wealth, but an expanded vision of the world, one that reached from the forests of Sweden to the palaces of Byzantium. Thus, the story of the Varangians is not merely about mercenaries, but about the entanglement of cultures. Through them, Byzantium and Scandinavia were bound together, each shaping the other in ways both subtle and profound. The Vikings had carved out empires in England and Normandy, in Ireland and Russes, but here, in the heart of Byzantium, they achieved something just as remarkable. They stood at the centre of the medieval world, guardians of the emperor himself, symbols of how far men from the fjords had come. The Caspian Sea, shimmering like a vast inland ocean beneath the sun, lay far from the fjords of Scandinavia, yet Viking keels cut across its waters, with the same confidence they had shown in the North Sea or the Irish Sea. To reach it was an ordeal of endurance and cunning. Ships had to be dragged across portages, through rapids, and down rivers that twisted from the Baltic, through the forests of Russia to the Volga. But the Norsemen, already accustomed to threading their way along narrow channels and heaving vessels over land, saw only opportunity in this inland highway. Beyond lay the riches of the Abbasid Caliphate, the greatest empire of its age, with markets that consumed slaves and furs with insatiable hunger and that paid, above all, in silver. The Volga trade route became one of the arteries of Viking expansion. The Russ's merchant Scandinavians, who had carved bases at Novgorod and later at Kiev, used it as their lifeline to the Islamic world. By the 9th century, fleets of longships had transformed into caravans that moved upriver with goods gathered from across the northern forests. Fox pelts, sable and marten furs, beeswax, honey, amber, and above all, human captives filled their cargo holds. These commodities, trivial in Scandinavia's subsistence economy, became treasures when bartered for Islamic dirhams. Tens of thousands of these silver coins, stamped with Arabic calligraphy, found their way back north, where they were buried in hoards across Sweden and Gotland, testifying to the scale of the exchange. The Vikings did not simply trade. They raided, too, the Caspian shores, dotted with prosperous Muslim cities, invited the same tactics that had terrified monks on Lindisfarne. In 913, a fleet of hundreds of ships descended through the Volga into the Caspian, ravaging as they went. Chronicles from the region record how the Rus plundered settlements, looted markets, and carried off captives, unlike in the West, where Viking raids became the spark of long-lasting political entanglements. These expeditions often burned bright and brief, flashes of devastation before withdrawal, yet they showed the extraordinary reach of Norse daring. Few in Baghdad or Samarkand could have imagined that men from the edge of the known world might appear at their doors, swords in hand, hungry for silver. The Abbasids themselves, however, were less vulnerable than their European counterparts. The Caliphate commanded vast armies and wealthy cities, and its rulers had centuries of experience dealing with raiders and nomads. The Vikings quickly discovered that open confrontation was risky. They might sack a few coastal towns, but the Caliphate was too strong to be subdued, and so commerce, more than conquest, became the dominant mode of interaction. Rus's envoys travelled to Baghdad, where they marvelled at the palaces and mosques, presenting gifts and receiving permission to trade. The Arabic geographer Ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Norse merchants on the Volga in 921, left one of the most vivid descriptions of their way of life. He recorded their tall frames, their elaborate tattoos, their unwashed habits, and their shocking funeral rites, where a dead chieftain was sent to the afterlife on a burning ship with a sacrificed slave girl. To Ibn Fadlan, they were both barbarous and mesmerizing, a people of strange customs but undeniable vitality. This exchange of impressions mattered as much as the exchange of goods. For the Vikings, the Abbasid world represented an empire of unimaginable wealth, a market that consumed what their homeland could supply in endless quantities. For the Abbasids, the northern traders were at once a nuisance and a resource, bringing raw materials from forests and steppes that their urban economies demanded. It was a relationship of mutual utility, sustained by the flow of silver, and silver was everything. Without native mines, Scandinavia depended on imported coin to fuel its growing economy. Dirhams became not just currency but the bedrock of wealth, melted into ornaments, hacked into hack silver for payments, or buried as hoards to secure families against famine and feud. The Viking Age itself, in many ways, was powered by the silver of Islam. The darker side of this commerce was slavery. The forests and plains of Eastern Europe became hunting grounds for captives, many drawn from Slavic populations, others from steppe peoples caught in the net of Viking expeditions. These men, women, and children were marched in chains downriver, their fate sealed in distant markets. In the souks of Baghdad or the ports of the Caspian, they were sold into households, armies, and harems. Their suffering underpinned the prosperity of Norse merchants, who built reputations and dynasties on the profits of human lives. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia, slave chains, collars, and even evidence of branding bear grim witness to this human economy. Yet for all their brutality, the Norse were also agents of connection. Along the Volga, they established way stations that became multicultural hubs, where Slavic, Finnic, Turkic, and Norse tongues mingled. They carried not just goods, but stories, technologies, and ideas. From the Abbasids, they acquired not only silver, but techniques in metalwork, new forms of coinage, and a glimpse into advanced urban life. From the steppe nomads they met along the way, they borrowed tactics of cavalry and styles of dress. These influences trickled back into Scandinavia, subtly reshaping the culture of the fjords into one that was not only northern, but cosmopolitan. The Caspian expeditions also revealed the limits of Viking power. Unlike in England or Normandy, they could not hope to seize land and rule it. Geography, climate, and the sheer might of the caliphate prevented permanent settlement. Instead, they learned to be intermediaries, facilitators of exchange, lords of the river highways. Their presence in the East was less about crowns and kingdoms than about networks and nodes, the flows of goods and wealth that bound distant worlds together. It was empire, not of territory, but of circulation. By the 10th century, the rhythm of this interaction was well established. Fleets might still descend on the Caspian to raid, but more often, Rus's merchants appeared in caravans, their ships laden with northern produce. The Abbasid dirhams kept flowing, and with them, the lifeblood of Viking expansion. In the long view, it was this connection with the Islamic world that allowed Scandinavia to flourish, to fund the construction of towns, to mint its own coins, to build the very structures that transformed a society of farmers and raiders into states. Thus, east of Eden, beyond the familiar coasts of the Atlantic, the Norse carved another chapter of their saga. They stood on the banks of the Volga, in the markets of Baghdad, on the shores of the Caspian, and proved themselves not just pirates or settlers, but global traders, linking birch forests to desert mosques. Their ships carried not only swords, but the very pulse of a connected world. And though the chronicles remembered their raids, it was the silver of the Abbasids and the human cargo of the slave trade that truly powered their expansion, fueling an age when men from the fjords reached into the heart of empires and bent them, if only slightly, to their own advantage. The leap into the North Atlantic was less a single voyage than a slow edging outward, one island at a time, until men in open boats were sailing where no one had dared before. The Faroes were the first stepping stones, lonely green humps in the sea, where seabirds wheeled and grass grew thick enough for sheep. Settlers found them by accident, perhaps driven off course by storms, but once discovered, they became indispensable way stations. The Norse brought sheep, goats, and a few hardy cattle, letting them graze on the wind-swept turf. Small communities clung to these rocky outposts, enduring the long winters with what the sea and pastures could provide. They were not wealthy, but they were essential anchors along the ocean road. The real prize was Iceland. Around 870, word spread of a vast island far to the northwest, green in summer and empty of kings, where a man could claim land simply by throwing his high-seat pillars ashore. The attraction was irresistible. Norway's coastlands were crowded, jarls demanded allegiance, and ambitious farmers longed for independence. The ships began to come, carrying families, livestock, and carved beams to raise new halls. Within a few generations, the volcanic island was covered with scattered farmsteads, each carved from the lava fields and meadows that edged the fjords. The settlers built turf-walled houses against the bitter winds, fished the icy waters, and grazed sheep on upland pastures. Harsh though the land was, it offered freedom that many prized above comfort. Here, on the edge of the known world, they built not just farms, but a society. The Althing, founded in 930, became one of the world's earliest parliaments, a gathering where free men came each summer to recite laws, settle disputes, and proclaim judgments. Without a king, the islanders relied on consensus and the authority of law speakers, who carried in memory the codes and precedents of the people. Feuds still raged, sometimes for generations, but the framework of law gave structure to conflict. Out of these traditions grew the sagas, prose epics that told of heroes, wanderers, and feuds, but also of law, honour, and the fragile balance that held their society together. In Iceland, the Norse imagination found a new home, one that would preserve their memory long after their ships had ceased to sail. The leap did not stop there. Around the year 985, Eric the Red, outlawed from Iceland for killings, pushed further west to a land hinted at in stories. Greenland lay beyond the fog and ice, a harsh coast of glaciers and fjords where only the hardiest could hope to live. Yet even here, Norse settlers carved out a tenuous existence. They built farmsteads in the sheltered fjords of the south, raising cattle and sheep, planting small plots of barley, and hunting seal and caribou to supplement their diets. They named their settlements the Eastern and Western Settlements, though both clung to the margins of habitability. For a time, they prospered, trading walrus ivory, hides, and even polar bear pelts with Europe in exchange for iron, timber, and luxuries. But it was a life always balanced on the edge of failure, dependent on climate and the tenuous supply lines across the Atlantic. These new worlds demanded a different kind of resilience. The settlers, who crossed into the North Atlantic, could not rely on annual raids or tribute from wealthy neighbours. They had to make their lives from land and sea, coaxing crops from volcanic soil, watching over sheep through long winters, cutting turf for fuel, and reading the skies for storms that could cut them off for months. They learned to adapt to a fragile ecology, and when they failed, their communities suffered. Volcanic eruptions could blanket pastures in ash. Harsh winters killed livestock. Famines haunted the sagas, remembered as warnings of the price of miscalculation. Yet these same sagas also preserved a fierce pride in survival, in the ability of families to endure where few others could. At the same time, these Atlantic settlements remained connected to the wider Viking world. Nars crossed regularly between Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, carrying not only goods but stories, news, and people. Monks, traders, and adventurers drifted in and out, weaving these distant places into the larger fabric of the Norse cosmos. When Christianity spread into Scandinavia, it reached Iceland and Greenland as well, their wooden churches rising beside turf farms, bells ringing across fjords, where once sacrifices had been made to Thor. The conversion brought not only new beliefs, but new ties to Europe, as bishops and priests travelled the same sea roads as the traders and settlers. The sagas set in Iceland and Greenland show how deeply the Norse saw themselves as part of these landscapes. They spoke of farmsteads hemmed by lava fields, of winter assemblies where feuds were debated, while snow drifted outside, of voyages into the unknown West, where men glimpsed strange lands and peoples. These stories, half history, half legend, became the memory of a people who had pushed further into the Atlantic than any before them. They lived always with the sea at their door, and the possibility of disaster close at hand, but also with a sense of destiny that their courage had carved a world from ice and fire. The North Atlantic leap did not end with Greenland. From its fjords, ships pushed even further west, reaching the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. They called it Vinland, the land of wild grapes, though its promise was short-lived. Yet the attempt itself revealed the restless drive that had carried them from fjord to steppe. From Lindisfarne to Baghdad, wherever there was land, however harsh, and the possibility of freedom or wealth, the Norse would go. The Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland were proof that they could make homes in places others would have abandoned, that their ships and spirit could turn ocean wilderness into habitable worlds. In these harsh islands, the Viking Age took on a new character. No longer merely raiders or mercenaries, these settlers became farmers, lawmakers, poets, and chroniclers of their own past. The law codes of Iceland, the saga traditions born in smoky halls, the survival of communities in Greenland against impossible odds. These were as much the legacy of the Viking Age as the terror of their raids. The North Atlantic leap was less about conquest than about endurance, about carrying a way of life to the very limits of the world and watching it take root in soil that barely gave enough. It was here, at the edge of everything, that the Norse proved not just how far they could go, but how long their stories could last. The western horizon had always drawn Norse eyes. Sailors in Greenland told of driftwood from unknown forests, of seabirds flying in from beyond the edge of sight, of fishermen carried by storms who returned with tales of wider lands. From these whispers grew the boldest gamble of all the push into what would later be called North America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, set his sails westward from Greenland and made landfall on a coast unlike any he had ever seen. Grass grew thick. Salmon crowded the rivers. Forests stood ready for the axe, and wild grapes clung to the valleys. It was a place of abundance, so different from the ice-clenched farms of Greenland, that the Norse named it Vinland, the land of wine. Archaeology has given form to the sagas' memory. At the northern tip of Newfoundland lies Lancel Meadows, where the remains of turf houses and ironworking hearths reveal a small Norse outpost. The settlement was not grand, perhaps a few dozen souls, 8 buildings at most, but it marked the first known European foothold in the Americas, centuries before Columbus. Here, Norse smiths smelted bog iron, carpenters shaped timber, and sailors prepared their vessels for voyages deeper into the New World. The site was both a staging ground and a symbol, proof that Norse seamanship could cross an ocean and return. The sagas speak of voyages further south, to lands of warmth and fertility, where grapes and wheat grew wild. These accounts are tantalizing, mixing memory and myth, but they hint at journeys along the Canadian coast, perhaps even into New England. Wherever they went, the Norse found landscapes rich in resources that Greenland could never provide. Timber was particularly prized. The treeless settlements of Greenland desperately needed wood for ships, houses, and tools. For a time, Vinland promised a solution: a western granary and forest to sustain the struggling colony in the east. But Vinland was not empty. The Norse encountered indigenous peoples, whom the sagas called Skraelings. These encounters were charged with both possibility and peril. At first, there may have been trade. The sagas describe exchanges of red cloth for pelts, and it is easy to imagine wary groups meeting on beaches, bartering cautiously while watching each other's every move. Yet the meetings turned violent as often as they turned peaceful. The Norse, accustomed to seizing by force what they could not negotiate, quickly found that these new peoples were neither weak nor easily cowed. Arrows rained on their settlements, ambushes struck their hunting parties, and skirmishes left men dead. Unlike in Ireland or England, there were no monasteries to plunder, no chieftains to intimidate into tribute. The Skraelings fought on their own land, with numbers and knowledge of terrain that the Norse could not match. The sagas capture this tension vividly. One tale tells of a bull that broke free and terrified the Skraelings, sparking a battle that forced the Norse to retreat. Another recounts how a Norse woman, Freydis, seized a fallen man's sword while pregnant and, baring her breast, charged the attackers until they fled in fear. Whether legend or history, such stories reveal the precariousness of Norse life in Vinland. Each contact carried the risk of escalation, and in the end, the settlers recognized that they were intruders in a land too vast and too hostile to be mastered. Even without conflict, sustaining a colony across the Atlantic strained Norse resources. The distance from Greenland was immense, the voyage perilous, and the manpower required to defend an outpost against indigenous resistance drained what was already a fragile society. Greenland itself was a tenuous colony, barely surviving on the margins of habitability. To stretch its strength further west proved beyond its means. The Norse were adventurers, yes, but they were also pragmatic. When costs outweighed gains, they cut their losses. Vinland was abandoned after only a few decades of experimentation. The reasons for withdrawal went beyond hostility and hardship. Overreach was the quiet enemy. The Viking Age had always thrived on mobility, on striking where opportunity was richest, and retreating when resistance hardened. Vinland offered riches in theory, but no immediate treasure comparable to the silver of the Abbasids or the tribute of England. It was too far to raid profitably, too exposed to settle securely, and too costly to maintain. The Norse left behind no great fortresses, no carved stones, only faint imprints in turf and sagas that blurred fact with legend. Yet failure should not obscure achievement. Lansog Meadows stands as proof of an extraordinary feat of seamanship and imagination. These were not men with compasses or maps, but sailors who trusted in memory, stars, and the flight of seabirds to cross an ocean no one else in Europe had dared to cross. They carried their culture into a new continent and stood, however briefly, at the threshold of a world unknown to the rest of medieval Europe. Even in failure, they expanded the boundaries of what was possible. The Vinland voyages also reshaped Norse identity. They revealed both the daring that had carried them from fjord to steppe and the limits of their model of expansion. Raiding and settlement worked where wealth was concentrated and resistance could be subdued. In North America, neither condition held. The Skraelings could not be dominated, and the land, though rich, did not yield tribute or treasure that could justify the costs. For the first time, the Norse met a frontier where courage and ships were not enough. Still, Vinland did not vanish from memory. For centuries, stories of the Western lands lingered in Icelandic sagas, told by firesides as part of a larger narrative of wanderers and settlers. They were half history, half myth, but they carried the seed of truth that Norsemen had once crossed the great Western Ocean and seen a new world. When later Europeans began their own voyages of discovery, echoes of Vinland stirred in their minds, a reminder that boldness could reach beyond the horizon. Thus, Vinland became both an achievement and a cautionary tale. It showed that the Norse had the skill to reach North America, but not the capacity to hold it. It was a moment when the Viking spirit met its boundary, not in courage, but in the practical limits of manpower, distance, and resistance. The turf houses at Lansor Meadows, the fragments of iron slag, the sagas of Leif and Freydis, all speak of a people who dared more than most, yet who also knew when to turn back. Vinland was the edge of their world, the final leap of an age of expansion that had already carried them from Lindisfarne to Constantinople. On those windswept shores, the Norse proved both the greatness of their reach and the inevitability of their retreat. The Viking Age began with fire and steel, with sudden raids that left monasteries in ashes and rulers scrambling for defences. Yet over time, the sword gave way to the plough, and the raiders who once terrorised coasts became the builders of towns, markets, and even kingdoms. Their shift from marauders to landholders was not a betrayal of their origins, but the next step in their restless drive for wealth and security. To seize a monastery's gold was one thing. To seize the land that produced it and the trade routes that carried it promised something more lasting. Across the Viking world, places, once known only as harbours for warships, became bustling towns. Hedeby, on the border of Denmark and Saxony, grew from a riverside settlement into a trading hub where furs from the north, silver from the east, and luxuries from the south all changed hands. Its houses lined narrow streets, its quays bustled with merchants, and its workshops rang with the sound of smiths and weavers. Archaeology reveals carefully planned streets, evidence of coinage, and even defences, an earthen rampart to protect its growing prosperity. Hedeby was not unique. Birka in Sweden, Kaupang in Norway, Ribe in Denmark all emerged as nodes in a web of commerce that spanned from the North Atlantic to the Black Sea. In the West, the process was just as dramatic. York, once Eoforwit, became Jorvik under the Danes. What had been a Roman ruin reawakened as a Viking capital, filled with craftsmen, merchants, and markets where goods from as far as Byzantium and Baghdad were traded. Streets paved with timber carried traffic past shops selling amber beads, antler combs, and fine cloth. Coins minted in Jorvik bore the names of Norse kings, proof that these were no longer transient raiders, but rulers who claimed permanence. Dublin, once a fortified longfort, a war camp transformed into a town with shipyards, slave markets, and bustling quays. It became the most important Norse settlement in Ireland, a centre for trade as much as conquest, where Hiberno-Norse kings minted coins and ruled over mixed populations of Norse and Gaelic subjects. This transition from raider to ruler demanded new skills. Warfare could seize wealth quickly, but ruling required systems of taxation, coinage, and markets. Minting coins marked a profound change. To stamp silver with a king's image was to declare not just wealth, but authority, to bind commerce to legitimacy, where once the Vikings had melted down foreign silver to weigh in hacks and ingots. Now they created their own currencies. These coins travelled widely, carrying the names of Norse rulers across Europe and into the East, a declaration that they had become part of the world of kings. Urbanization followed power. The same rivers that had carried dragon-prowed longships inland now carried barges of grain, hides, and timber to feed growing towns. Settlers built houses of wattle and daub, dug wells, laid out streets, and constructed wharves. Markets flourished, drawing not only Norse merchants but Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Slavs, and Arabs. These towns became melting pots, where Scandinavian speech mingled with Latin, Celtic, and Slavic tongues. and where technologies and ideas flowed as readily as silver. Settlement also transformed the Norse relationship to the land. The warrior who once measured success in plunder now measured it in acreage, in rents collected from tenants, in the ability to sustain a hall filled with retainers through harvests rather than raids. Kings and jarls granted land to loyal followers, cementing bonds of fealty. These new landlords built churches, fortified manor farms, and sponsored markets. The Viking who had once boasted of burning a monastery might now boast of founding one, filling it with monks who prayed for his soul and legitimized his rule in the eyes of Christian neighbours. Yet this transformation did not erase the old Viking spirit. The same men who minted coins and founded markets still rode to war when opportunity demanded. Kings of Dublin launched raids into the Irish countryside, while rulers of York warred with Anglo-Saxon neighbours. But increasingly, their goals were not the spoils of a single summer, but the control of land, trade, and tribute that would last generations. A kingdom was simply a raid made permanent. This shift was also visible in law and governance. The Thing, the traditional assembly of free men, adapted to urban settings. Towns held their own gatherings, where disputes were settled and rules enforced. Kings issued laws, blending Scandinavian custom with local traditions, creating hybrid legal codes that reflected their diverse populations. Norse rulers learned to govern not just Norse settlers, but Anglo-Saxons, Gaels, Slavs, and others, binding them with promises of justice and prosperity. Architecture reflected this permanence. Wooden halls rose within fortified walls, churches appeared alongside pagan shrines, and bridges spanned rivers once guarded with chains to stop enemy ships. The Norse, who had once gloried in destruction, now gloried in construction. Even as their stonework was crude compared to their continental neighbours, the symbolism was clear. They had come not just to plunder, but to stay. This transformation also reshaped identity. A man born in Dublin of a Norse father and Gaelic mother might speak both tongues, trade with both worlds, and see himself not as a foreigner, but as a citizen of a new, hybrid realm. The same was true in York, where Norse customs blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions, and in Normandy, where descendants of Rollo would one day ride as Christian dukes. The Vikings did not simply impose their culture, they absorbed and adapted, creating new societies where identities fused, from steel to soil. The story of Viking transformation is not one of abandonment, but of expansion. To raid required courage, but to settle required vision. To burn a monastery was a feat of arms, but to found a town, mint coins, and govern a kingdom was a feat of statecraft. The Norse proved capable of both. Their legacy lies not only in the terror of their longships, but in the enduring towns and states they carved from the lands they once ravaged. York, Dublin, Hedeby. These names echo not just as places of conquest, but as the birthplaces of new societies that carried the Viking spirit into a different age. The raiders, who had once seemed like ghosts appearing from the sea, became neighbours, rulers, and kings. Their longships still prowled the rivers, but their coinage now circulated in markets, and their laws bound diverse peoples into new polities. The Viking Age was no longer just about shock and awe at sea. It was about permanence, about forging order from chaos, about building as well as burning. In this shift lay the true measure of their conquest. Not simply half the world raided, but half the world remade. Silver was the bloodstream of the Viking Age, coursing through markets, ships, and halls, linking Scandinavia to distant empires. While the sagas remembered raids and battles, it was commerce relentless, calculated, and often brutal. that sustained expansion. Without silver, the plundered monastery was a fleeting triumph. The Great Hall, a fire without fuel. With it came loyalty, prestige, and power. The economy of the Viking world was built on metal and flesh, and it reached across continents. For centuries, Scandinavia had little in the way of its own coinage. Gold was rare, silver rarer still. The wealth that poured into the north during the Viking Age came from beyond, carried in dirhams from the Islamic caliphates, denarii from the Carolingians, and ornaments melted into hack silver. Traders on the Baltic and river highways funneled Arab silver northward, where it was chopped, weighed, and tested with bites. In Viking hoards, unearthed in Swedish fields, thousands of Arabic coins lie side by side with arm rings and hacked fragments, each piece telling of a world where currency was weight, not stamp. These hoards were banks buried in the earth, savings against famine, tribute, or war. The dirham trade was more than numbers. It reveals the astonishing reach of Norse commerce. From Baghdad and Samarkand, caravans carried silver to the Caspian, where it met the ships of Swedish merchants. Furs from the forests, wax from the hives, and above all, slaves from raids in the Slavic lands were exchanged for those gleaming coins. The Abbasid world hungered for fur and flesh, luxuries for its courts, and labour for its armies. The Vikings became middlemen in this economy, bridging steppe and sea, selling people alongside pelts and honey. Every coin unearthed in Gotland is a reminder of this dark network, where prosperity was measured in the lives of others. In the West, too, silver fueled ambition. The Carolingians discovered that it was cheaper to buy off the raiders than to fight them year after year. Thus the Danegeld was born. Tribute payments of thousands of pounds of silver delivered to Viking armies camped outside Frankish cities. These ransoms, meant to buy peace, only financed further campaigns. Each chest of silver became wages for warriors, timber for ships, and gifts to bind men to their leaders. What looked like appeasement from Paris looked like investment from a longship's prow. The great leaders of the Viking Age, Guthrum, Knut, Rollo, did not thrive on courage alone, but on treasure chests heavy with silver coin. Yet silver did not flow endlessly. It was used, weighed, divided, and reworked into the ornaments and arm rings that symbolized loyalty. A Jarl rewarded his followers not with promises, but with visible gifts. Rings of silver hacked from a greater hoard, coins pressed into calloused hands. The gift was more than payment. It was a bond of honour, proof that loyalty had worth. In this way, silver tied together the warband and the kingdom, a material foundation for the intangible ideals of loyalty and fame. The towns of the Viking world became hubs where this silver translated into industry. Hedeby's workshops turned ingots into jewellery. York's artisans carved combs and fashioned swords. Dublin's shipyards built vessels for trade and war. These towns thrived not only because of raids, but because of exchange. Exotic goods flowed in, silk from Byzantium, glass beads from the Rhineland, spices from the East. Each item testified to the Vikings' role as brokers in a global economy. Middlemen who brought the far corners of the known world into contact. At the heart of this economy lay slavery. Raids filled ships with captives as much as with gold. Monasteries yielded manuscripts and chalices, but they also yielded monks who could be ransomed or sold. Villages yielded women and children who could be marched in chains to markets at Dublin or Hedeby. Archaeology confirms the scale of this trade. Pens and enclosures at long forts designed not for cattle, but for humans, evidence of shackles and confinement. The sagas mention thralls almost casually, as part of daily life, ploughing fields, tending fires, raising children who bore the stigma of slavery. This was the hidden foundation of Norse prosperity. the human cost often lost beneath the glamour of longships and silver hoards. The Vikings themselves were not immune. Defeat in battle, debt, or disaster could reduce a free farmer to servitude. Freedom was precarious, and the boundary between carl and thrall thinner than heroic poetry suggested. Yet the scale of the trade, stretching from the Irish Sea to the Caspian, shows that for many leaders, captives were more valuable than chalices. Silver bought loyalty, but slavery generated the silver. Over time, this brutal commerce reshaped society. As wealth concentrated in towns and in the hands of rulers, inequality deepened. The free farmer, who had once been the backbone of the Thing assemblies, found himself increasingly dependent on great lords who controlled the flow of silver and land. Slavery reinforced these hierarchies, creating visible layers of privilege and exploitation. The sagas preserve echoes of resentment, stories of thralls who rose to prominence, or of free men reduced to bondage. But in the larger arc of the Viking Age, the economy of silver and slaves bound Scandinavia more tightly to the currents of global trade. This dual economy, bright silver and dark bondage, explains much about the Vikings' astonishing expansion. It bankrolled fleets, supported towns, and turned raiders into kings without the dirham flow, without the hack silver hoards, without the endless stream of captives. The Viking Age might have burned bright, but brief. Instead, it endured for centuries, fueled by commerce as much as conquest. It is tempting to see the Vikings as purely warriors, defined by axe and shield. But to understand their reach, one must follow the silver trail. From Baghdad to Dublin, from Frankish treasuries to Icelandic hoards, it was silver that made possible the leap from fjord-bound chieftains to rulers of empires. Yet silver was never abstract. Every coin carried the weight of the human suffering that earned it. Every hoard buried in a Scandinavian field was built on chains and cries. The Vikings conquered with steel, but they endured with silver and slaves, a legacy as complex as it is unsettling. The Viking world was not only shaped by the clash of swords and the sweep of longships, but also by the women who farmed its soil, managed its households, sailed on its ships, and sometimes commanded its stories. While medieval chroniclers and later historians often painted them as shadows behind their warrior husbands and sons, archaeology and the sagas tell a more complex tale. In Scandinavia, women enjoyed a degree of legal and social autonomy rare in much of contemporary Europe. Their influence woven into the fabric of both home and hall, their presence felt in markets, farms, voyages, and even, perhaps, on the battlefield. The foundation of women's authority lay in law. Viking legal codes granted women rights that would surprise those who imagine a world ruled entirely by men. A woman could inherit property in the absence of brothers, and widows often managed estates outright. Marriage was a contract between families, not a captivity. And if a husband failed in his duties or dishonoured her, a wife could initiate divorce. The sagas describe women returning to their fathers' homes with their dowries intact, their reputations untouched by shame. This capacity for exit gave them leverage within marriage, ensuring that even powerful men had to account for the dignity of their wives. On the farmsteads that dotted the Scandinavian landscape, women were managers as much as companions. With men often absent on voyages or campaigns, the responsibility for livestock, harvest, and household economy fell to their hands. The sagas refer to them as key keepers, holders of the household keys that symbolized authority. In Icelandic law codes, the mistress of the house was charged with distributing food to guests, a duty not just of hospitality, but of status, shaping the reputation of the family. Women brewed ale, wove textiles, tended herds, and oversaw servants. These activities were not mere chores, but central to wealth, trade, and survival. The cloth they produced became currency. The ale they brewed a cornerstone of feasts that bound communities together. The graves of Viking women reveal this authority in tangible form. Burials across Scandinavia contain not only jewellery and domestic tools, but keys, symbols of household power, and in some cases weapons. The most famous is the grave at Birka, long thought to be a warrior man, furnished with sword, axe, and horse, only for modern DNA testing to reveal the remains were female. This discovery reignited debate over whether women fought as warriors. Some insist the Birka burial proves women could be leaders of warbands. Others argue that the symbolism does not confirm combat. Perhaps the truth lies between, that while the vast majority of warriors were men, women could, in extraordinary circumstances, assume martial roles. The sagas preserve tales of shield maidens, women who dressed in mail, bore arms, and rode to battle, their names whispered in both admiration and unease. Yet even without spear in hand, women wielded power in other arenas. The sagas often show them as instigators and counselors, urging husbands and sons toward vengeance or peace, shaping the choices of men with words as sharp as steel. Njal's saga tells of Bergthora and Holgertha, women whose quarrels echo through the blood feud that consumes their families. In Laxdæla saga, Gudrun Osvifursdottir emerges as one of the most compelling figures of Icelandic literature, a woman whose decisions alter the course of generations. Such portrayals are not passive ornaments, but active participants in the drama of law, honour, and feud. Women also moved beyond the household. Archaeological finds show female graves along trade routes, buried with scales, weights, and imported goods. They were merchants as well as farmers, managing trade in cloth, jewellery, and household wares. The sagas mention women travelling overseas, accompanying their husbands to Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland. Some were widows, seeking new opportunities, others adventurers in their own right. The Norse expansion was not merely a male migration. Whole families crossed seas, and women's labour and resilience made settlement possible. In Iceland, the Althing, the Great Assembly, was a male preserve, but behind each free man stood the work of a household sustained by female hands. Religion and ritual provided another sphere of authority. While Odin and Thor may have dominated warrior oaths, the spiritual practices of everyday life often rested with women. The Volur, seeresses who practiced Seidr, commanded fear and respect. Draped in cloaks of feathers, carrying staffs, and surrounded by ritual, they were believed to summon visions, control fates, and even bend battles with their magic. Their role blended spiritual authority with social power, and their presence in sagas and graves suggests they were both revered and feared. To accuse a man of practicing Seidr was to impugn his masculinity, but women who did so carried legitimacy, tapping into traditions that predated the Viking Age itself. The evidence of burials reveals the richness of women's roles. Jewellery, imported silks, and brooches suggest access to international trade. Grave goods of weaving tools speak to their control of one of the most valuable commodities of the age, textiles, which functioned as both clothing and currency. In some high-status graves, horses accompany the women into death, a symbol of rank normally reserved for men. These finds complicate any simple narrative of male dominance and female passivity. The Viking Age was not an egalitarian utopia. It was a world where force often decided fate and where patriarchy was real. But within it, women carved out spaces of authority larger than many of their contemporaries in Christian Europe. Their capacity to own property, divorce, travel, and trade gave them autonomy. Their participation in settlement and colonization made them indispensable. Their role in religion and saga memory made them unforgettable. Perhaps the clearest measure of their influence is how often women in the sagas are remembered by name, while countless male warriors are left faceless in the tide of battle. Women were anchors in a restless world, keepers of home and continuity, but also catalysts of change and ambition. Whether holding keys, weaving cloth, brewing ale, or urging vengeance, they shaped the arc of Viking society as surely as the men who swung axes and sailed seas. To tell the story of the Vikings without them is to see only half the picture. Their world was one of steel and soil, silver and slaves, but also of women who stood at its heart, negotiating, managing, prophesying, sometimes fighting, always enduring. In the end, the Viking Age was not simply the story of warriors, but of families, communities, and a culture where women's presence was woven into every strand of its fabric. In the Viking world, power was not anchored to a distant crown or a codified bureaucracy, but to gatherings under the open sky, where free men assembled in circles to debate, decide, and deliver judgment. These assemblies, called things, were both parliament and court, places where law was spoken aloud, where feuds were mediated, where alliances were forged, and where reputations could rise or collapse in a single afternoon. The sagas describe them with the drama of theatre, because they were theatre ritualized performance of community authority, backed by the memory of ancestors and the threat of violence should words fail. At the heart of this system was law, but carried in the minds of law speakers who memorized the precedents and recited them in rhythm, so the community might remember. In Iceland, the lögsögumaður stood at the law rock during the Althing and proclaimed the statutes that bound the people together. It was a fragile form of justice, dependent on memory, consensus, and trust. But it worked, creating a framework of shared norms in societies that lacked central rulers or standing armies. The power of law lay in its ability to settle disputes before they spiraled into endless bloodshed. Yet law was only half the fabric. Honour was the other. A man's worth was measured not in coin or land alone, but in his ability to defend his name and kin. To be insulted without reply was to invite humiliation. To be wronged without response was to risk annihilation. The sagas preserve countless scenes where insults carry the weight of weapons. A taunt at a feast could spark years of feud, but an oath sworn before witnesses could settle disputes, restoring balance to a community always on the edge of violence. Reputation was currency as real as silver, and the thing was the mint where it was weighed and tested. Outlawry embodied this balance of law and honour. To be declared an outlaw was more than punishment, it was social death. A full outlaw was stripped of protection. Anyone could kill him without consequence. His property forfeit, his name erased from society. Lesser outlawry, often for 3 years, forced a man to leave the community, but held out the hope of return. This was exile as justice, a way of removing danger without perpetual bloodshed. The sagas recount men who thrived in exile, building fame abroad before returning to reclaim honour at home, proving that even punishment could be transformed into opportunity in a world that prized resilience. The things themselves were marvels of consensus governance. Local things handled disputes of villages and districts. Larger regional things united broader territories. The Icelandic Althing, founded in 930, served as a national assembly without king or crown. Here, chieftains and farmers alike gathered in a kind of parliament unique in medieval Europe. Decisions emerged not from command, but from negotiation, persuasion, and compromise. The loudest voices did not always prevail. Cunning and reputation could outweigh force of arms. The very act of gathering, of sharing meals and rituals, reinforced bonds that made society cohere. Despite its decentralization, violence was never far from these gatherings. Feasts during the thing might end in duels or skirmishes. Armed men accompanied their leaders, ready to remind opponents that law without force was fragile. But the public nature of the assembly meant that bloodshed was risky. To kill before witnesses was to invite collective condemnation. Thus, the thing created a space where words could substitute for swords, where oaths and judgments carried the authority of the community. It was a precarious peace, but it was peace nonetheless, and it allowed Viking societies to expand and settle without dissolving into endless vendetta. This framework of law and honour extended outward into the Viking diaspora. In Dublin, in York, in Novgorod, Norse settlers brought with them their assemblies and customs, transplanting the thing as a portable institution, even as they built towns and minted coins. They gathered to decide disputes in the old way. The sagas of Iceland, written centuries later, preserve the memory of these assemblies, not as relics, but as the heart of social order. Kings might rise in Denmark or Norway, but even they were expected to honour the thing, to seek its consent before declaring wars or levying taxes. Authority that ignored the assembly risked rebellion. For in a world of free farmers and proud warriors, legitimacy flowed from consensus as much as command. The rituals of the thing underscored its sacredness. Oaths were sworn on weapons, on rings, or at shrines, binding men to their word with both social and spiritual weight. Perjury was not just dishonour, it was blasphemy, an insult to gods who valued truth as much as courage. Disputes might be settled with compensation wergild, the man price paid for injury or death. This system of compensation turned vengeance into negotiation, placing a calculable value on life and honour. While to modern eyes it seems cold, it was, in truth, a way to prevent endless cycles of killing and to recognise loss while preserving community. The Viking Age empires, if they can be called empires, were not built on centralised monarchies like their contemporaries in Carolingian Europe or Abbasid Baghdad. They were webs of alliances, settlements, and assemblies, knit together by law and honour. A chieftain might command a fleet for a raid, but his power depended on the consent of those who followed him. A jarl might rule a territory, but his judgments were tested at the thing. Even the kings of later Scandinavia found their authority shaped by assemblies that could acclaim or resist them. The thing was both brake and engine of Viking society, restraining ambition while enabling cooperation. In this lies the paradox of Viking expansion. They conquered without kings, traded without centralized markets, ruled without standing armies. Their decentralized world functioned because law and honor created invisible bonds strong enough to stretch across seas. The same oath that bound a man to his neighbor could bind him to a leader on campaign or to a community in a distant settlement. The same fear of outlawry that restrained feuds at home restrained betrayal abroad. What gave coherence to the far-flung Norse diaspora was not bureaucracy, but culture, a shared sense that reputation mattered, that assemblies spoke with authority, that law was memory, and that honour was survival. The Viking Age ended, but the echoes of the thing persisted. The Icelandic Althing survives into the present as one of the world's oldest parliaments. Scandinavian monarchies still retain traces of their old assemblies. The legacy of law and honour, of consensus and reputation, outlived the longships and the raids. It was this invisible structure that allowed the Vikings to be more than marauders, to become settlers and builders, to forge communities that endured. Beneath the clash of steel, lay the murmur of voices at the Thing, shaping a society where governance was not imposed from above, but hammered out among equals. A society where law and honour made decentralised empires function. The Viking Age began with raiders sacking Christian monasteries and ended with Scandinavian kings building churches of stone, staffed by priests who read Latin and carried parchments marked with crosses instead of runes. This transformation was not sudden, nor was it purely spiritual. Conversion to Christianity reshaped power itself. It gave kings new tools for consolidating authority, binding fragmented clans into kingdoms, and connecting the northern world to the currents of European politics and culture. The story of Scandinavia's baptism is therefore a story of both faith and statecraft, of men who saw in the cross not only salvation but sovereignty. At first, Christianity arrived not by kings but by contact. Merchants carried more than silver and cloth along the trade routes to the north. They carried words of a new faith. Slaves, often captured in raids, brought Christian prayers into Scandinavian households, whispering them at night, or carving subtle symbols on combs and amulets. Envoys from Frankish and Anglo-Saxon courts preached at royal halls, and missionaries like Ansgar in the 9th century risked storms, bandits, and indifference to carry the gospel to Hedeby and Birka. These early efforts found footholds but little permanence. Pagan cults were resilient, and the appeal of Thor's hammer or Odin's wisdom proved hard to uproot in a world where strength, honour, and fate defined life. What changed was kingship. By the 10th century, Scandinavian leaders faced a problem. Their authority, rooted in charisma, wealth from raids, and fragile alliances at the Thing, could easily crumble. A rival with enough ships could overthrow a Jarl. A failed harvest could undermine a dynasty. Pagan religion, fragmented across local cults to gods and land spirits, provided no centralized priesthood to bolster royal power. Christianity offered something radically different: a unified belief system, a literate clergy, and links to rulers abroad who styled themselves as God's anointed. By adopting baptism, a king could cloak himself in divine legitimacy, claim heavenly sanction for his laws, and bind his people under a single altar as well as a single crown. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark was among the first to grasp this. His famous runestone at Jelling proclaims that he made the Danes Christian, though the truth was less straightforward. Conversion was uneven, sometimes coerced, sometimes embraced. Pagan shrines were torn down or quietly abandoned. Stone churches rose in their place, often built on sites of older sanctity. Yet Harold's political calculation was clear. By embracing Christianity, he aligned Denmark with the powerful Ottonian Empire to the south, deterring invasion while bolstering his fragile dynasty. Missionaries brought literacy, enabling clerks to keep records, draft laws, and manage royal estates. Christianity, in Harold's hands, was less about personal piety than about welding a patchwork of chieftains and clans into something resembling a kingdom. Norway's baptism was more turbulent, carried by kings whose zeal was sharpened by exile and foreign experience. Olaf Tryggvason, raised in Russia and baptized in England, returned to Norway in the 990s with sword in one hand and cross in the other. His conversion campaigns were as much military as spiritual. Pagan temples burned. Those who resisted were forced to choose between baptism and exile. Saga writers, centuries later, cast Olaf as a fiery apostle king, a man who spread the gospel through both persuasion and terror. Yet beneath the legends lies a political reality. Olaf sought to centralize power in a land of fractious jarls. Christianity gave him a framework, a network of priests, and an ideological justification for demanding loyalty that went beyond kinship. Olaf Haraldsson, remembered as Saint Olaf, carried this further. His reign in the early 11th century represents the decisive moment when Christianity became not just a king's policy, but a people's identity. He too wielded conversion as both faith and strategy. But unlike Tryggvason, he lived long enough for his legacy to endure. His death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, struck down by his own countrymen, paradoxically sealed his triumph. Declared a saint by the Church, his shrine at Nidaros became the spiritual heart of Norway. Kings who followed could not ignore the cult of St. Olaf. To rule Norway was to embrace Christianity. Faith and crown had become inseparable. The sagas dramatized these conversions with tales of confrontation between old gods and new. Pagan farmers protest the destruction of Thor's idols, only to see storms disperse at a bishop's prayer. Seeresses warn that Odin's wisdom is fading, even as priests preach of salvation and eternal life. Behind the stories lies a real cultural upheaval. Festivals once devoted to sacrifices at pagan Hof were redirected into Christian feasts. Burial practices shifted from grave goods and ship interments to east-facing, cross-marked cemeteries. Runes gave way to Latin script, though they lingered in folk use for centuries. What was lost was continuity with ancestral cults. What was gained was entry into a vast cultural network, stretching from Rome to Canterbury to Constantinople. The impact on governance was profound. Literacy transformed administration. Where once memory and oral recitation held the law, now clerks could draft codes, treaties, and charters. The Church provided a class of educated men, loyal to both God and King, capable of recording property rights, managing taxation, and corresponding with foreign courts. Kings, who once ruled through personal charisma, could now anchor their authority in institutions. The Church itself, with its parishes and bishops, created a new infrastructure of loyalty that paralleled and reinforced royal power. Christianity also shifted warfare. Raiding Christian lands became more problematic once Scandinavians embraced the same faith. Not that it ended violence. Vikings continued to fight, but now as mercenaries or in dynastic wars framed in Christian terms. The Varangians still served in Byzantium, and Norse warriors still fought across Britain, but now with crosses sewn into banners, fighting under kings who invoked Christ instead of Thor. Violence was sanctified, not abandoned. Kings could now declare their wars as just, cloaking ambition in holy cause. Conversion did not erase pagan belief overnight. Folk traditions persisted, with land spirits honoured in quiet rituals, charms whispered over children, and Thor's hammer amulets worn alongside crosses. The fusion of old and new shaped a distinctive northern Christianity, one that kept echoes of the sagas, even as it adopted the Bible. But in the eyes of rulers, the essential change had occurred. Christianity was now the official framework of legitimacy, and kings could not be kings without it. The story of Scandinavia's conversion is not simply one of missionaries and miracles. It is the story of kings who leveraged faith as a tool of consolidation, who saw in baptism both salvation and sovereignty. Harald Bluetooth raised his stone to proclaim it. Olaf Tryggvason burned temples to enforce it. Olaf Haraldsson died to sanctify it. In their hands, the cross became more than a symbol of belief. It became the architecture of power. Through Christianity, the Viking Age closed not in chaos, but in consolidation. With Scandinavian kings firmly planted in the soil of Christendom, their rule legitimized not only by sword and silver, but by the blessing of heaven. When the longships first carved their wakes into the rivers and seas of Europe, no one could have imagined that a few generations later their descendants would stride across battlefields as lords and kings, speaking French, building castles, and ruling over lands as far apart as England, Sicily, and the Levant. These were the Normans, literally Northmen Vikings, who had settled in the lush lands of northern France and reinvented themselves into one of the most dynamic forces of the medieval world. They were not merely raiders any longer. They had become conquerors with the discipline of knights, the language of courts, and the ambitions of empire. If the Viking Age had begun with fire on monasteries, it ended with stone castles and cathedrals that reshaped the map of Europe. The story begins with Rollo, a Viking warlord who harried the coasts and rivers of Francia in the early 10th century. The Carolingian rulers, exhausted by endless raids, decided that if they could not beat the Vikings, they might as well hire them. In 911, King Charles the Simple offered Rollo and his followers land around the Lower Seine in exchange for peace and protection against other raiders. It was a gamble, but one that paid off. The Vikings settled, intermarried, and took root. They adopted the French tongue, converted fully to Christianity, and began to reshape themselves. Their new homeland came to be called Normandy, and within a century it had grown into a duchy famed for its warriors, its discipline, and its restless ambition. This transformation from raiders to rulers was not a surrender of Viking spirit, but its evolution. The Normans retained the fierce adaptability of their ancestors, but now combined it with the feudal structures of Frankish society. They built castles to dominate landscapes, trained as armoured horsemen, and cultivated a reputation for both ferocity and faith. They fought with a combination of Viking boldness and knightly organisation, blending northern aggression with continental sophistication. Where the Viking had once struck from the sea, the Norman rode at the head of disciplined cavalry, bearing the cross on his banner. The most famous expression of this fusion came in 1066, when Duke William of Normandy, later called William the Conqueror, launched his invasion of England. His claim to the English throne was contested, but his resolve was absolute. Crossing the Channel with a fleet that echoed his ancestors' voyages, he met Harold Godwinson's army at Hastings. There, Norman cavalry, archers, and infantry fought in coordination against the English shield wall. The Bayeux Tapestry immortalised the clash. Horses charging, arrows falling, Harold struck in the eye. William's victory did more than win him a crown. It marked the permanent transformation of England. A land that had resisted Viking raids for centuries now fell to their descendants. Not as plunderers, but as rulers. Castles rose across the countryside. French became the language of the court, and the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman traditions laid the foundation for medieval England's institutions and identity. But England was only one arena of Norman ambition. Far to the south, Norman adventurers carved out principalities in Italy. By the 11th century, bands of Norman knights, often younger sons with no inheritance in Normandy, travelled as mercenaries to southern Italy, where Byzantine and Lombard rulers vied with Muslim forces from Sicily. They fought first for pay, then for land, gradually transforming from hired swords to lords of territory. The most famous among them, the Hauteville family, began with a minor noble from Normandy who sent his sons southward to seek fortune. Within 2 generations, those sons had conquered Apulia and Calabria, seized Sicily from Muslim emirs, and established a Norman kingdom in the heart of the Mediterranean. The conquest of Sicily was more than a military triumph. It created a realm where Latin Christians, Greek Orthodox, and Muslims lived under Norman rule, a cultural fusion that produced one of the most cosmopolitan courts of the Middle Ages. The palaces of Palermo blended Islamic architecture with Byzantine mosaics and Latin fortifications. Here, the Norman spirit showed its adaptability once again, ruling not just by sword, but by synthesis, drawing on the talents of Arabs, Greeks, and Latins to create a kingdom admired across Europe. The Normans' restlessness carried them even further. Some of their number rode east during the Crusades, where their prowess earned them fiefs and titles in the Levant. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, became Prince of Antioch after the First Crusade, establishing yet another outpost of Norman power. In less than 2 centuries, the descendants of Rollo had gone from raiding monasteries to ruling territories, from the Channel to the Levant, leaving an imprint on nearly every shore their longships or horses could reach. What made the Normans so effective was not just their martial skill, but their ability to adapt. They absorbed languages, laws, and cultures wherever they went, yet always retained their hunger for land and status. In Normandy, they became French. In England, they reshaped Anglo-Saxon governance. In Italy, they fused with Lombards and Byzantines. In Sicily, they presided over a court that blended 3 civilizations. The adaptability that had once allowed Vikings to be traders, raiders, and settlers now allowed the Normans to be kings, dukes, and princes across a fractured Europe. The shadow of the Vikings lingered in their legacy. The castles of Normandy were heirs to the fortresses of Scandinavia. The Norman reliance on kinship and warbands echoed the comitatus of their ancestors. Their boldness in battle carried the same spirit that once launched longships into unknown seas. But now that spirit was channeled through feudal structures, papal blessings, and dynastic ambition. The axe had given way to the lance, the longhouse to the stone keep, the pagan rune to the Christian cross, but the drive for conquest remained unchanged. By the 12th century, the Normans had ceased to be seen as outsiders. They were kings of England, lords of Ireland, princes of Antioch, rulers of Sicily, yet their origins remained a vital part of their myth, a reminder that their blood carried the salt of the sea and the fire of the fjords. They were the second act of the Viking story, proof that the energy unleashed in the 8th century had not dissipated but transformed, reshaping Europe in ways that would endure for centuries. The Normans were not merely a continuation of the Viking Age, but its culmination. They showed what could happen when raiders became rulers, when warriors became state builders, when the restless hunger for more was married to the structures of feudalism and the faith of Christendom. From Hastings to Palermo, from Rouen to Jerusalem, their footsteps marked the ground of history. They were Vikings too, and their conquests redrew the world. The image of a Viking, axe in hand and helmet gleaming, has been polished into legend, but the true story of their tools of war and of peace is richer, subtler, and more revealing. The Vikings carried with them an arsenal that was practical before it was romantic, shaped by the realities of their world and their resources. They were not only fighters, but builders, crafters, and maintainers of a seafaring civilization. Their tools were never just weapons or ornaments. They were the instruments of survival, conquest, and continuity across lands and generations. If there was a weapon that defined the Viking, it was not the sword but the spear. Spears were cheap to make, efficient in battle, and versatile in hunting. They could be thrust in close combat or hurled at a distance, and their iron heads, often leaf-shaped, could pierce armour and shields alike. Every freeman was expected to own one, and sagas describe lines of spearmen advancing, shields overlapping, in grim efficiency. The sword, by contrast, was rare and costly. forged of layered steel, often inlaid with patterns or inscribed with names. It was a prestige object, a marker of rank. A sword might be passed down through generations, bound up with family honour. Yet in the press of battle, the spear and the axe did the work. Axes, adapted from farm tools, were brutally effective, their broad heads capable of splitting shields and men alike. Some, like the famed Dane axe with its long shaft and crescent blade, were specialised instruments of terror, wielded by elite warriors who carved through lines with sweeping blows. Defensive tools were no less essential. The round shield, often made of planks bound with iron rims, was as much a weapon as a protection. Warriors formed shield walls, overlapping circles of wood and iron that became the backbone of Viking tactics. Behind these barriers, men could thrust spears and axes, holding off cavalry or infantry with cohesion that magnified individual courage into collective power. Mail armour, rings of iron linked together, was the preserve of the wealthy. But even a simple helmet of iron or leather could mean the difference between life and death. Contrary to popular imagery, no horns adorned those helmets. Instead, they were functional, close-fitting, designed to deflect blows. The warrior's kit was pragmatic, not theatrical, but the Vikings were more than fighters. They were builders. To take and hold territory, they needed more than longships and courage. They needed fortifications. Across Scandinavia and their settlements abroad, they raised earthen ramparts, palisades, and timber halls. In Dublin, excavations have revealed carefully laid streets, fortified walls, and long-fought ship enclosures that doubled as military bases and trading hubs. In England, they built fortified bridges, not only to control rivers, but to thwart enemy fleets. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with bitterness how Viking bridge building denied local defenders the ability to cut them off. The Vikings understood that control of waterways was control of territory, and they invested their labour in wood and earth as surely as in iron. Their logistics were as impressive as their weaponry. A longship was not simply built. It had to be maintained, caulked with tar and wool, its sail patched with cloth, its oars replaced when worn. This required a community of craftsmen, blacksmiths hammering rivets, carpenters shaping planks, weavers producing sails from wool that had been spun, dyed, and stitched. A single sail might take years of work from dozens of sheep, and the women who spun their wool. Every raid and expedition was underpinned by the quiet, continuous labour of those who stayed behind, ensuring that ships and gear were seaworthy. Without this infrastructure, no Viking fleet would have left the fjords. Craftsmanship extended far beyond the battlefield. Viking artisans were skilled in wood, bone, and metal, producing not only tools and weapons, but intricate ornaments, brooches, and combs. Their artistry carried a style that was instantly recognizable: interlaced beasts, spiraling motifs, patterns that adorned everything from sword hilts to ship prows. These were not luxuries alone. They were statements of identity, portable symbols of culture carried from Scandinavia to the farthest settlements. Even in distant Greenland, settlers carved chess pieces from walrus ivory, testifying to both their skill and their connection to a wider world. Textiles were another pillar of Viking life. Women's weaving produced not just clothing, but sails, the very engines of Viking expansion. Archaeological finds show looms and spindle whorls in nearly every settlement, evidence of a domestic industry that had strategic importance. Without sails, the longship was crippled. Without cloth, no expedition could travel far. Textiles were also a form of wealth and trade, their fine quality admired across Europe. Just as silver dirhams and hacked ingots fueled Viking commerce, So too did the cloth woven in northern homes. Weapons and crafts merged in symbolic ways. The making of a sword or the carving of a ship's prow was not only a technical task, but a ritual act, often accompanied by charms or invocations. Runes inscribed on weapons or amulets were believed to channel divine power, binding luck and fate to the object. The line between tool and talisman blurred. A spear was not just sharpened iron, it could be consecrated to Odin before battle. A shield might bear painted symbols to ward off harm. In this world, every tool carried both physical and spiritual weight. The Vikings also mastered the art of adapting their tools to context. On the open sea, the longship was unmatched, but for inland rivers, they built smaller, shallower craft. In the forests of Eastern Europe, they fashioned sleds to drag goods over portages between rivers. In settlements, they built houses adapted to local materials. Sod walls in Iceland, stone in the Orkneys, timber in Denmark. This flexibility was itself a tool, allowing them to thrive in environments from the ice of Greenland to the fertile plains of Ukraine. Even their law and governance had material echoes in their tools. The Thing, the assembly where disputes were resolved and laws pronounced, was often held on specially prepared sites. Stones set in circles, platforms raised, sometimes even permanent structures erected. The very spaces of their legal culture were tools of cohesion, physical anchors of the values that bound communities together. In the end, the Vikings thrived because they combined tools of destruction with tools of creation. Spears, axes, and shields brought them victories. But without the labour of smiths, weavers, and builders, those victories would have faded into nothing. They were as much a people of soil and craft as of sea and steel. Their legacy is found not only in the sagas of war, but in the artefacts of daily life. The loom weights, the rivets, the combs, the fragments of cloth that whisper of hands long vanished. These, too, were the tools that conquered half the world, sustaining the warriors who carried Viking names into history. When people picture the Vikings, they often see horned helmets, berserkers frothing in animal skins, and endless fire sweeping across terrified villages. But archaeology, with its quiet layers of soil and fragments of bone, tells a far more complex story. The trowel, the isotope lab, and the genetic sequencer have become weapons against myth, steadily reshaping our understanding of the Northmen. What emerges from the earth and the lab bench is neither the cartoon barbarian of 19th century opera, nor the flawless heroes of nationalist sagas, but a human people whose lives were rooted in land, trade, craft, and a restless drive for opportunity. The horned helmet is the most enduring fiction. No Viking burial, no battlefield site, no horde has ever produced one. The few ceremonial helmets with animal ornamentation predate the Viking Age by centuries, belonging more to Bronze Age ritual than to Norse warfare. The helmets that Vikings actually wore were pragmatic, iron domes, sometimes with a nasal guard, designed to deflect a sword strike. Yet the image of horns clung, popularised by Romantic artists and Wagner's operas, a symbol of savagery that resonated with audiences eager for melodrama. Archaeology leaves us with something less theatrical, but more real. Warriors, concerned with survival, not spectacle. Excavations across Scandinavia and the wider Viking world have revealed a material culture both sophisticated and deeply interconnected with global trade. At Rebay and Hedeby, the remains of workshops, moulds, and discarded tools show towns buzzing with artisans who crafted jewellery, combs, glass beads, and weapons. At Dublin, streets layered with timber planks reveal careful urban planning, while middens spill over with imported wares from as far as the Middle East. The dirt yields evidence that Vikings were not merely raiders, but town builders, market makers, and craft producers whose daily lives revolved around far more than pillage. Burial sites speak with particular clarity. At Oseberg, 2 women were interred in a ship laden with textiles, carved sledges, and ornate animal-headed posts. The richness of the grave, dendrochronologically dated to 834, challenges assumptions that Viking wealth was only martial, showing instead the centrality of women, craft, and ceremony. At Birka, graves with weapons and armour have long been assumed male, until genetic analysis revealed at least one belonged to a woman. The so-called female warrior debate rages on, but the science forces a reckoning with old biases. Vikings were not bound by our assumptions of gender roles. Their society could be flexible in ways archaeology still struggles to define. The science of isotopes has opened further windows. By analysing strontium in tooth enamel, researchers can pinpoint where a person grew up. Graves once assumed to belong to locals have turned out to contain individuals from faraway Scandinavians, buried in England, English in Scandinavia, even evidence of movement between the Baltic and the Mediterranean. Oxygen isotopes reveal diets heavy with marine resources in coastal regions, while inland graves show cereal-based sustenance. Such details paint a world of mobility, adaptation, and diversity, undermining myths of a homogeneous, isolated warrior race. Genetic research has gone even deeper. Studies of ancient DNA from Viking burials reveal surprising variation. Not all who were buried with swords were of Scandinavian ancestry, and not all Scandinavians buried abroad lived lives of conquest. Some carried British or Baltic genetic signatures, indicating intermarriage and assimilation. The Viking world was less an ethnically uniform tide sweeping outward than a web of interaction, absorbing and blending as much as it imposed. Myth insists on pure bloodlines of heroic stock. Science shows the mingling of peoples and the porousness of identity. Dendrochronology, the analysis of tree rings, has been especially powerful for dating Viking activity. Wood from ships, halls, and fortifications can be cross-matched to regional growth patterns, sometimes to the exact year of felling. It is through dendrochronology that we know when the great ring fortresses of Denmark were built in the late 10th century, likely under Harald Bluetooth's direction. These precise dates anchor sagas and chronicles in the firm soil of evidence, transforming legend into a verifiable timeline. Where myth floats in fog, tree rings carve a chronology. Even the saga of Vinland has been tested and reframed by science. Excavations at Lance Ork Meadows in Newfoundland unearthed unmistakable evidence of Norse presence: iron nails, turf walls, spindle halls, and radiocarbon dating places it around 1000 CE. More recently, cutting-edge analysis of solar storm imprints in wood growth confirmed that Norse explorers were active in North America exactly then. The myth of Columbus discovering the New World has been permanently altered by archaeology. The Vikings crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries earlier. Pop culture, though, lags behind. The towering berserker, impervious to pain, remains a trope. Yet, what we find in the sources and bones suggests something subtler. Men who may have used substances, rituals, or mental conditioning to steel themselves for battle. Was there a cult of Odin's chosen who entered trances in combat? Perhaps, but archaeology gives no proof of supernatural rage. What it does give us are bones bearing the scars of trauma, healed and unhealed. Testimony to a life where violence was frequent but survivable. The berserker of myth is an exaggeration of a truth. Vikings fought hard, suffered wounds, and often lived with them. The collision between myth and evidence also plays out in how Vikings are remembered culturally. Nationalist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries claimed them as ancestral paragons of purity, discipline, and conquest. In reality, the archaeological record shows cosmopolitanism, hybridity, and integration. Viking towns were melting pots where Slavs, Celts, Arabs, and Scandinavians mingled. Grave goods from as far afield as Samarkand or Baghdad sit beside local pottery. The conquerors of half the world were also participants in it, reliant on exchange and connection. What archaeology ultimately delivers is humility. It strips away the operatic horns and the nationalist bravado, replacing them with fragments of combs, rivets, spindle whorls, and gaming pieces. These small, ordinary objects tell extraordinary stories about lives lived in complexity. Caught between myth and necessity, they remind us that the Viking world was not a fantasy but a lived reality, one where faith, craft, and struggle intertwined. The Vikings of popular imagination may never die, but beneath the ground and under the microscope, a truer picture emerges. They were not gods in horned helmets, nor demons sent to scourge Christendom. They were men and women of the north, whose ships carried them across seas, whose crafts sustained their homes, whose bones still speak across a millennium. Archaeology has not diminished their story. It has deepened it, replacing caricature with complexity and showing how myth, when tested, can give way to history far more fascinating than fantasy. When the dragon-proud ships were finally beached and left to rot, when kings and jarls traded spears for sceptres, the Vikings did not vanish. Their legacy seeped into the soil, the speech, the laws, and even the DNA of the lands they touched. Though the sails came down in the 11th century, the currents they set in motion still shaped Europe centuries later. The Norse were absorbed into kingdoms that called themselves English, French, Russian, or Irish, yet the fingerprints of their presence remain in place names, customs, and the very bodies of their descendants. The Viking Age may have ended, but its echoes still ripple across maps and genomes alike. The simplest traces lie in names etched across landscapes. In England, villages ending with by and Thorpe speak of Norse settlement. Grimsby, Whitby, Scunthorpe. By was their word for a farmstead or village, Thorpe for a secondary settlement. To drive through Yorkshire or Lincolnshire is to pass through a linguistic archive of Viking colonisation. In Ireland, the city of Dublin derives from Dublin, the Black Pool, where Norse longforts once anchored. Normandy, the land of the Northmen, still carries in its very name the memory of Rollo's bargain with the Frankish crown. These place names are fossils of presence, enduring long after wooden halls decayed and graves fell silent. Law, too, bears their imprint. In England's Danelaw, where Norse rule once extended, customs diverged from the Anglo-Saxon South. Concepts of jury trials and collective responsibility, though with earlier Germanic roots, were sharpened by Norse practice. The very word law comes from Old Norse lag, meaning that which is laid down. Their assemblies, the things, where free men debated disputes and reached consensus, set a precedent for participatory governance that persisted in Iceland's Althing, the world's oldest continuous parliament, and reverberated in later European institutions. The Vikings, once feared for smashing monasteries, left behind frameworks for law and order that outlasted their raids. Language absorbed them as well. English carries hundreds of Norse loanwords, absorbed during the centuries of contact and conquest. Everyday terms like sky, egg, knife, husband, and window betray Scandinavian roots. even pronouns they, them, their, slipped into English from Old Norse, permanently altering grammar itself. These were not the grandiose words of sagas, but the basic building blocks of daily life, proof that coexistence between Anglo-Saxon and Norse speakers created a blended tongue. In Normandy, Norse became French within a generation, yet the descendants of those Northmen carried their martial traditions to England in 1066, reshaping the English language once more through the fusion of Norse, French, and Anglo-Saxon streams. Genetics confirms what place names and words suggest. The genomes of modern populations in Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and even parts of Russia carry distinctive Scandinavian signatures. DNA extracted from Viking burials shows not only movement outward, but also integration inward. Men and women from the British Isles buried in Sweden, Slavs interred in Denmark, a patchwork of ancestry woven through mobility and marriage. Iceland's population retains deep Scandinavian roots, yet also Celtic contributions from the Irish women who travelled unwillingly or otherwise with settlers. Genetic studies reveal that Viking identity was less about blood purity than about belonging to networks of power, trade, and settlement. To be a Viking was not always to be Scandinavian by birth, but to be part of the cultural and economic webs they spun. Those webs rewired Europe's trade. Before the Viking Age, much commerce in the north was local, seasonal, and fragile. The Norse connected it into a continental system stretching from the North Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. Silver coins from Baghdad were hacked into pieces in Scandinavia to serve as bullion. Furs from the forests of Finland ended up in the souks of the Abbasid Caliphate. Amber from the Baltic glowed in markets of the Mediterranean. By force and by negotiation, the Vikings turned rivers, seas, and coastlines into arteries of exchange. Towns like Hedeby, York, and Novgorod flourished as hubs, stitching together Europe's fragmented economies into something closer to a system. State formation, too, was accelerated by their impact. In England, the shock of the great heathen army pushed Alfred and his successors to centralise, fortify, and legislate in ways that birthed a stronger kingdom. In France, the granting of Normandy to Rollo created a powerful duchy that would one day conquer England and dominate Mediterranean politics. In Russia, the Varangian princes of Kiev laid the foundations of a state that tied Slavic tribes together under one banner, eventually claiming a legacy that endured through czars and emperors. Even in Scandinavia itself, where petty chieftains had once held sway, the need to resist Christian kingdoms abroad and consolidate tribute at home propelled the rise of monarchs like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Haraldsson. The Viking Age ended, but the kingdoms it forced into being endured. Culturally, the Norse left behind sagas, poems, and stories that outlived their world of raids and farmsteads. Written down centuries later, the Icelandic sagas preserved not only heroic tales, but the rhythms of a society where law, honour, and fate intertwined. The myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki, once whispered at firesides, were fossilised in manuscripts that would later inspire everything from romantic art to modern fantasy epics. Yet the greater cultural legacy lay not in mythology, but in the adaptability that their expansion had demonstrated. They were pagans who became Christians, raiders who became kings, outsiders who became insiders, always leaving a trace in the societies they touched. Even the map of Europe bore their marks. The Viking push across seas and rivers created new borders, new centres, new possibilities. Iceland and Greenland entered the human story because of them. The North Sea was knit into a political unit under Knut. Normandy became a hinge between Scandinavia and France. The Irish Sea transformed into a Norse lake, with Dublin at its heart. The Baltic became a highway, not a barrier, linking Scandinavia to the Slavs. These geographies, once marginal, became central, altering Europe's balance of power long after the Viking sails disappeared. Their legacy is complicated. They brought devastation to countless communities, carried away slaves in chains, and drenched coastlines in fire. Yet they also created towns, laws, and markets, married locals, and seeded cultural fusions that gave rise to England, Normandy, Rus, and more. Their DNA is in modern Europeans, their words in modern speech, their laws in modern institutions. They did not conquer half the world in the sense of ruling it, but by movement, exchange, and integration, they embedded themselves everywhere. After the longships were drawn ashore, their timbers weathering into silence, the Norse lived on not as raiders on horizons, but as ancestors, builders, and transmitters. Their world ended, but their legacy became Europe's, and in every by-town in England, every jury trial in court, every strand of northern DNA, every story of Thor's hammer, the Vikings remain, long after their sails were furled.